Hey guys, welcome to Fanfic Fanatics. So in today's video we are gonna see, what if Deku became Beast of Woods and fell in love with Mina? Part 2. Before starting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you are interested in MHA fanfictions. This story is Beast in the Woods by Big Teddy 3498. Now without wasting any more time, let's dive in. Izuku packed his laptop away and stretched his back. He turned to Kacchan, who just finished packing his things to go home for the day. All right. Let's go. Izuku led the way to the door. He opened it and a crowd stood behind it. Izuku stared at everyone. Hello. Is this normal, Kacchan? He greeted them all in a group and asked his old friend. They are here to scout the competition in the sports festival. Some might want to join the hero course if they didn't manage the first time around, he explained. Oh, that makes sense. Well, I'm Izuku. Nice to meet all of you. He beamed at them all. He sniffed the air and caught a familiar blonde hair. Monoma. You passed the exam, that's great. Ah, hello, Izuku. Nice to see you again. I thank you for being so understanding in the exam. It's a shame you are in class 1A and not in mine. Monoma greeted his acquaintance. Hey, I was thinking if you copied my quirk and changed some things in your body, would they stay after the time limit wore off? Because if it stayed, you could do some many things. He got close to Monoma's bubble without any hesitation as everyone watched the odd boy. That does sound intriguing. Like what? Monoma was a bit of a quirk nerd and was very interested in what Izuku was talking about. Like, Izuku raised his hand to show his skeletal structure covered in steel, but Shinso stopped him. Let's not traumatize the whole first year with your... He waved his hand at Izuku's whole body. Abilities. Izuku, let's go already, Kacchan called from down the hall. Coming, Kacchan. See you later, Monoma. Bye, Shinso. Bye, Mina. He said his farewells. Later, Zuku, Mina said in return. He's weird. A gray-haired boy next to Monoma said. It's better to have him like this instead of how he was at the USJ. The remaining 1A class inside shivered at the memory of Izuku tearing apart the monster and taking his trophy from its prone body. What's that supposed to mean? Monoma asked Shinso. He saw how Izuku treated Shinso and could figure out that they were friends. No, you have to wait for the surprise like the rest of the class did, Shinso said. He was terrifying, Mina said, but he's great the rest of the time. Someone's biased. Jiru smirked at the redding of Mina's ears. Izuku got off the train with Kacchan and followed him down the street. Izuku looked around with very faint memories as he walked. He stopped at a park and could remember he and Kacchan played at it when they were young. The blonde noticed he has stopped and waited for him in silence. He shook himself out of his thoughts and caught up with the blonde. Kacchan walked up to the door of a modest home and Izuku remembered it faintly. He followed. We're here, Kacchan called inside. Mitsuki ran around the corner and pushed Kacchan out of the way to hug Izuku behind him. Oi, Izuku. I'm so glad you are okay. She almost had a heart attack when Ua called to tell them about the USJ. Masaru patted his disgruntled son's shoulder. How was school? Back to normal. Sports festival is still on, he said to his father. Mitsuki pulled Izuku to the couches and sat him down. Come on, tell me, how have you been? Izuku gently lowered himself to the couch. It creaked only slightly. You've gotten heavy, haven't you? She laughed. Masaru joined them and Kacchan dropped his bag next to the couch and sat on the recliner. Yay, I've gotten heavy from both my bones and muscles. He held his arm out and a layer of muscle was exposed in the bone. The muscles looked like a solid mass of red cords and the forearm bones were both covered in silver metal. Mitsuki and Masaru looked shocked at the display but adjusted quickly. Mitsuki took his arm and examined the exposed arm. No blood flowed out. I told you his quirk was freaky, Kacchan said with a smirk. What is your quirk? Masaru was also peering inside Izuku's arm. I can manipulate my cells and make them do what I want. He extended tendrils to wave, for example. Does this hurt? Mitsuki asked, gesturing to the open arm. Nope. Just feels odd is all. If you can control your cells, then you did this to your body? Why? Mitsuki gently tapped the metal on the bone. Izuku let them play with his arm and explain. Well, when I first discovered my quirk, I couldn't do much else than shift my legs, grow claws, or heal cuts and broken bones. So, I went to find a library because I remembered that they had books about everything. I wanted to do more with my quirk and make my body ideal. Ideal for what? Mitsuki let go of his arm and it closed up. For hunting at first, now for being a hero. I met one and decided to try the exam out with Shinso. That's my friend that lives near the library I went to learn. He smiled at the memory. This Shinso never told their parents about you living in the woods? Masaru asked. Not my fault. I never said to keep it a secret, but I was fine where I was anyway, he shrugged. Mitsuki got quiet for a moment and asked, was it hard? Izuku's smile dropped a little. At first it was. I was lucky to find a stream with fish in it and a cave nearby. I got my quirk around 7 I think, and that made stuff easier. When I got used to my quirk, it became fun. He tried to smile again to reassure Mitsuki. It didn't quite work because she began to cry again and pulled Izuku into a hug. She didn't say anything but held him and he gently returned the hug. I'm happy you're back. She pulled back and wiped her face. Tell me, why do I smell a perfume that doesn't belong to me? She got a wicked gleam in her eye. Izuku had noticed the odor that clung to some of the girls in his class and could tell Mina's from the others. He also knew when the smell stuck to him, during the cafeteria. Oh, that's Mina's. We took a picture together, I'll show you. He pulled his phone out and the screen lit up with the background of Mina's arm around him and leaning toward him with a beaming smile. Shinso had a lazy smile. Juru smiled normally, and Shoji had a peace sign on one of his hands. He pointed at the pink girl next to him. That's her. Mitsuki took the phone and examined the girl that was very close to Izuku. Masaru peeked over her shoulder and had the same thought as his wife. Wow, Izuku, you work fast. And she's so pretty too, she tried to tease. Yay. I've made 3 new friends and Kachan counts too, I guess. Of course, I count. And yay, she is pretty, he nodded along. Mitsuki turned full to him when her tease didn't work. What have you guys done together? She tried again. Mom. Kachan tried to say but he was waved to quiet down. Lots of things. She taught me a few things when I didn't what they were. I even brought her to my den in the woods. She is really nice, he smiled innocently. Mitsuki's eyebrow almost touched her hairline. Mom, he doesn't get it. He's been in the woods for 10 years, he isn't going to have the same thought process as anyone else would. Kachan explained. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. She's trying to tease you about Mina, Masaru explained with a smile. I still don't understand that and Nem refuses to explain it to me, he grumbled. Oh, you sweet innocent boy. Mitsuki ruffled his hair. Will you tell me what it is to me? Izuku's eyes shone. Nope. And stood up. Izuku pouted and Mitsuki chuckled. Come on, I've made dinner. Mitsuki went to the kitchen to serve everyone with Masaru adding some last ingredients to the meal. Kachan set the table and Izuku stood awkwardly outside the kitchen. Kachan caught his eye and jerked his chin to help him with the plates. Izuku copied his friend on how to place them in front of each chair. Izuku saw the chairs and was very doubtful they will hold his weight. He'll deal with it 2 minutes into the future. Once done setting plates of food on the table, everyone dug in. Izuku was smart enough to wait for everyone to start eating first to copy their way of eating. After all, this will be his first time using utensils in 10 years. His plan for sitting on the very fragile chair was to extend tendrils to the ground to support his weight. Carapace-like material covered the tendrils and he sat over the wooden chair. So, tell us Izuku. That Mina girl was awfully close to you. Katsuki, is she like that with everyone or just him? Mitsuki went back to trying to tease his nephew. Kachan snorted softly. Only him, every time they're close, he held nothing back. Leave the boy be. Masaru tried but was promptly ignored. He shook his head fondly at them. Yep. I think it's what Nem told me about girls being weird. It doesn't make too much sense since Juru, the other girl, isn't weird like Mina. Izuku mimicked them using the utensils and was proud to say he was successful at it. Granted he cheated by extending a tendril under his spoon for more control. Nem? Is that the other woman at court with you? Mitsuki asked. It's midnight, he even took her family name, Kachan explained. The 18+ hero Midnight? She sounded doubtful about her watching over Izuku. When the heroes arrived at the USJ, she went to check on him first even though I was right next to him. She didn't even notice me until she was sure Izuku was alright. He gave the lewd hero some support. Mitsuki made a thoughtful sound. That's good to hear, but back to Mina. Kachan groaned but was ignored as well. What do you think of her? Mitsuki leaned in. Izuku chewed and swallowed the chicken bone he had. Think of her? He was confused. Kachan raised a hand to stop his mother from asking something else. He doesn't understand what she is trying to ask, as if you like her. Of course, I do. If I didn't, I wouldn't talk to her. He tilted his head as if it was obvious. That's good to hear you got good friends around you. Masaru cut them off before Mitsuki could continue down their planned road. She shot him a small glare and turned back to her nephew. What about you, eh? How do you like it there? It's okay. The woods there aren't as big as the other one, but it's nice. They gave me a room and everything, but I like to sleep in my den. The library has lots of different subjects I can find. He struggled to get a piece of meat and instead extended a tendril to the end of his spoon to snag it. They kept chatting for a while longer as they ate dinner. Izuku was happy to reconnect with his old family friends. Mitsuki didn't talk too much about their past since Inko was part of a lot of it and she wanted to have a nice dinner. The time came and it began to get dark. Mitsuki tried to get him to stay the night, but Izuku was fine to head back to his den. Kachan rode with him to the station where they get off for Ua to make sure Izuku didn't get lost. It was very clear to see where to go from the train station. The gates of Ua opened automatically for him and he strolled in and headed to his furs. In the week that came, Izuku studied new things in the library, but he was beginning to run out of things he could mimic with his quirk. He knew the next step would be to try and mimic quirks, but he would have to see how the quirk of a person interacts with their body. For example, he couldn't mimic someone who breathes fire without knowing where the flammable gas came from and how it is made and ejected with the source of ignition. He could try, but putting a flammable gas inside his body sounds incredibly dangerous, even for him. Instead, he helped Shoji and Shinso with the upcoming sports festival. Shoji began to try different animal organs on his hands. He was very grateful for Izuku's help. Shinso, on the other hand, Izuku helped with his endurance and stamina. His quirk had some training, but there was only so much he could help with that. During one of the breaks from the exercise in the woods, Izuku asked Shinso, "You remember when I went to Kachan's house for dinner?" Shinso took a swig of water and nodded. "Suki, that's Kachan's mom, was asking a lot of questions about Mina when she found out we were friends. Is that normal?" Shinso had a pretty good idea of what kind of questions. What kind of questions? He smiled. Like, what kinds of things she taught me, or if I like her. Does your mom ask you those kinds of questions? It's weird. He tilted his head in confusion. Shinso smiled again at being right. Well, when she was asking you about Mina, it was supposed to be in a romantic sense. She was trying to tease you about having a close friend that was a girl because that's how it usually is. He shrugged. Izuku paused and processed the answer. Romantic sense, like for a mate? Or wife? Shinso breathed in the water he had just drunk and was drowning in the middle of the woods. He coughed up some water and turned to his dear friend. Yes, something like that. For many, it's embarrassing to talk about having or getting a girlfriend, much less a wife. Izuku made an O with his mouth in realization. That makes some sense. Wait, why was Suki only talking about Mina and not Juru? Because you talk about and to Mina more than Juru, and that usually signifies your interest in her more than Juru. Interested in her as a mate, girlfriend, he corrected. Are you interested in her as a girlfriend? Izuku thought about it for a long moment. I'm not sure, I do like her and talking with her. Shinso hummed and thought about all those soap operas he watched with his mom. Okay, how about this? I want you to imagine Mina holding hands and kissing someone else. What do you feel? Izuku pictured it and his chest felt cold at the image. He felt anger flare up and his fingers sharpened slightly. He looked in surprise at his hands. Oh, I didn't like that. Does that mean I want her as my mate? Girlfriend, he corrected again. Maybe, or maybe you are just protective. Okay, the same scenario, but it's Juru instead of Mina. He stopped and pictured it and he felt nothing similar to before. Nothing. He shook his head. Does that mean I should ask her to be my mate? Shinso shrugged. Are you interested in having a girlfriend? He emphasized the right word. Izuku hummed in deep thought and Shinso spoke again. How about this? Keep things as they are now until after the sports festival so she doesn't get distracted by you asking her out. Ask her to be my mate after the festival, all right. He nodded and stood back up. Are you doing that on purpose? Shinso narrowed his eyes at his friend. Izuku responded by giving him a cheeky smile. I swear. He threw a rock at him, but Izuku was already gone with a laugh echoing between the trees. So, he got back up for some training by trying to tag Izuku. His stamina has benefited greatly from this. The day of the festival was here and Izuku was annoyed. Why is it so loud? Even shifting my ears to normal, it's loud. Juru nodded along with him. That's how the festival is. It's very popular with everyone. The stands are sure to be full, and that doesn't even count for the people watching at home and not just in Japan. Izuku took all that in. Wow, that's a lot of people watching. You're not nervous? Mina asked. No, why? Izuku tilted his head in question. He followed Shinso's instructions and acted normal with Mina, even if he kept having that weird feeling when he remembered imagining Mina with someone else. Before she could say why it's normal to be nervous about being watched by millions of people, Todoroki approached Izuku and Kachan, who is sitting near Izuku. In power, I believe I am stronger compared to the two of you, he said to the two old friends. Izuku interrupted Kachan just as he was going to speak. It's not fair to compare between you and me. You shoot ice and I make my body do things. It's not the same. He moved his hands up and down in the scales motion. But you can compare to Kachan. He looked between the two and hummed in thought. He interrupted Todoroki just as he was going to speak. It's hard to tell. Kachan is good against one-on-one and less in a big area. You are the opposite. But you also have to remember he can shoot fire too, Shinso added. Izuku's neck snapped, literally, to Todoroki and his eyes shone. Really? Show me. Show me. He almost bounced as his friends looked slightly panicked at the noise that came from his neck. Todoroki was completely thrown off kilter by the feral boy's behavior but turned quickly when he was reminded of the other part of his quirk. I will never use fire, he almost hissed. Izuku came to a stop and observed Todoroki. Why? Does it hurt you? He was confused why someone wouldn't use their quirk. You wouldn't understand. He turned to leave. I don't, that's why I'm asking. Izuku only got more confused as Todoroki left. Mina patted his shoulder. Don't worry about it. Some people don't like their quirks or parts of them. Izuku pursed his lips in contemplation. I don't get it but okay. He shrugged it off. Line up. The sports festival is beginning, Yaoyorozu said to the room. Izuku forgot about what they were talking about and excitedly got up to begin the games they told him about. He was practically vibrating to everyone's amusement as they began to walk out into the sunlight. Shinso smiled behind his friend at his innocent behavior. Izuku was awed by the number of people around him. He spun around to see how many there were, and there were a lot. Shinso kept on gently guiding him forward to their seats as he kept slowing down. Izuku focused again forward when he sat down, with his patented carapace supports, and saw Nem strolling up to the stand. He waved at her, and she smiled at him. Quiet down. She spoke into the microphone. And welcome to this year's UA Sports Festival. The crowd cheered, and she raised her arm to quiet them down again. Now before we start, this year's first-year student representative's student oath. Izuku Kayama, she pointed straight at him. Oh, fuck. I forgot about that. Shinso cursed loudly while Mina was in between laughing and looking nervous about her friend. Shinso. Don't say bad words, also, what's going on? It was too late as Nem motioned him to come up to the stage. He did so and met her with a strained smile. She put her hand over the microphone and told Izuku, it's something we do every year. You have to say a short speech and at the end say plus ultra, got it? Izuku shrugged. He was placed in front of the microphone and spoke. This is really exciting. This is the first time I've seen anything like this. I guess I have to say a speech. I don't know how to make one of those, so good luck with the games. Plus ultra. He beamed for everyone to see and the crowd laughed and cheered with his enthusiasm. Such full of spirit. I love it. Now for the first round. An obstacle race. She explained what it was and every first year sprung up to get in a good position for the race to begin. Izuku's smile never fell as he got up and followed his classmates. Shinso caught up to him and said, use your quirk and get to the finish line as fast as possible. Izuku bounced in excitement. Okay, when do we start? Shinso smiled at his friend's behavior. You'll hear it. He patted his shoulder and got some distance for himself. The people around him looked at Izuku weirdly at his childish behavior but turned their attention to the front. Their attention was snapped back to Izuku when the flesh tore on his body and bones rearranged in his body. Some gasped in horror and backed away, and others just began to look sick. The brave few backed away finally when they heard a dozen giddy giggles of excitement from the beast before them. A bony tail extended from under his shirt with a spear at the end. His arms elongated and tore his sleeves as they bulged with muscles. Claws tipped his fingers and his paws grew more aggressive. Izuku always liked to call his full transformation hunter form. Start. Izuku disappeared from where he was in the middle of the tunnel, and everyone near looked around in panic as they lost sight of him. They finally found him leaping from wall to reach the end of the tunnel. Many gasps of shock and horror followed Izuku as he laughed and leapt out of the tunnel in a full sprint. Many in the crowd stood at his appearance and speed. The only way they could tell it was the same student from the stage was the uniform and green hair. Izuku laughed in glee at being able to run at his full capability. He quickly passed everyone including Todoroki, who shot a wall of ice in front of him, but Izuku just busted through it. On all fours, he ran with the wind blowing his hair back and showing his interlocked teeth in a smile. His 4 eyes were wide as they took in his surroundings. His eyes caught on the robots ahead like in the entrance exam. He heard President Mike saying they were part of the obstacles race and he would need to get past them one way or another. Izuku decided to have some fun and tore the head of one without slowing down and then sliced another in half with his tail whipped to the side. With a spin, he launched the head of the robot in his hand into another, and it tore through its chest. He kept running and slicing at robots in his path. A row of 3-pointers launched rockets at him, but a carapace shield blocked them and then smashed into the first one and a javelin punched through the other one. Nothing was safe in his path. Once done, he looked back and Todoroki was just reaching him with his classmates behind him. A path of destroyed robots led to Izuku and he laughed in joy. He turned around and began to sprint to the row of blocking 0-pointers. He ran under one and destroyed its leg so it would collapse into the next one. Metal gave way under his claws and its leg creaked under the damaged leg. It collapsed and tilted to the next 0-pointers and pushed it to collapse the next one in a domino effect. With that done, he sprinted to the next obstacle, which was a large pit with cables connected to pillars in between. He jumped without hesitation and swung from cable to cable. He jumped and clawed at the wall to climb up. His claws sunk into the rock without a problem and he leapt up to the next obstacle. The minefield. Don't worry, they bark more than they bite, President Mike yelled. What's a minefield? Izuku asked in a dozen voices, but no one answered him. He stepped on one immediately and he was pushed back. Was that the minefield? No response. Izuku looked at the field before him and saw where the bulges were. He stepped on one and it exploded. He nodded in satisfaction and one leg split into 2 and they narrowed into spider legs. His other leg followed and he began to scurry across the field without detonation. He heard an explosion and turned back to see Kacchan rocketing toward him. Izuku. I'm taking first place. He tried to get past him but a bony tail wrapped around him and threw him back. Izuku laughed. Nope. He crossed the finish right before Todoroki could turn him into an ice sculpture. He heard cheers and Izuku shifted back to normal and beamed at the crowd, who cheered even louder at his attitude. He had gotten first with Todoroki in second and Kacchan in third. He came up to Izuku and punched him in the arm with a grumble. Good job, I'll beat you next time. Izuku beamed at his friend and shot back. Then you should be faster. Izuku sat down on the nice grass and lay back with one tendril with an eye watching the finish line for his friends. He turned to Kacchan, who sat next to him. Hey Kacchan, what do I do after I ask someone to be my girlfriend? The blonde's eyebrows shot up. Who, Pinky? If that's Mina then yep. Kacchan huffed a laugh. You're supposed to take her out on a date first to see if you are compatible to be in a relationship. Then you ask her to be your girlfriend. Izuku hummed. Why can't I just ask her to be my girlfriend? I mean you can, but that's after getting close. We're close. He cut himself off as Mina passed the finish line and plopped next to Izuku. Izuku sat up and Mina leaned on his sturdy shoulder. I'm tired, Mina whined. Juru and Shinso passed right next to each other and came over to them. I think you scared most of the first years shitless when they saw you, he laughed. You shouldn't say bad words, Izuku said and shrugged at what Shinso said about scaring the others. Kachan stared at Mina, who kept leaning on Izuku. She caught his raised eyebrow and she blushed at being caught but didn't move as she stuck her tongue out at him. He made, "I'm watching you," signs at her and motioned to Izuku, who was oblivious to them. She blushed again when she looked at Izuku but determined, hooked her arm with his. Izuku smiled at Mina, who smiled back. Shinso, Jiru, and Kachan exchanged looks at that. Nem called the end of the first round just as the last spot was filled. "Next round. We have the cavalry battle." She explained the rules and Izuku listened attentively because he had no clue what a cavalry battle was. First place has 1 million points. "I'm first place," Izuku said loudly in realization. "I have all the points." He laughed and many who didn't know Izuku backed away from him. Nem smiled at him and snapped her whip. "Begin teaming up, you have 15 minutes. Izuku was left with his group of friends and frowned. "We have too many people." The four exchanged looks and Shoji raised his hand. "I shall join another team, good luck." They wished him good luck and they huddled up. "Izuku is going to be the horse, right? Because he weighs at least 500 pounds, Shinso said first. "I want to be the front horse." Izuku began to get excited again. "I can even carry you all too." "I think Shinso should be the rider. We all have mid-range attacks and he has his quirk." Izuku nodded along and Shinso shrugged. They went with the plan with Shinso as a rider, Izuku as the lead horse and Mina and Jiru on his sides. Izuku thought about what he should do and then nodded with a plan to shift. Carrying Shinso would be no issue for him, so he extended a set of tendrils to hold his legs and then shifted his arms to similarly bony whips. They moved around like snakes with tendrils at the ends for grabbing things more delicately. Many shivered when they saw him do that, but that was all he did. His legs shifted to his hunter form for more traction on the sandy floor. He opened his other set of eyes and another on tendrils on his shoulder, which he ripped the sleeves off. Monoma laughed nervously at the thought of almost copying that quirk without knowing exactly what it did. Once everyone mounted their teammates, Midnight raised her whip to signal the start. Izuku moved from foot to foot in anticipation of getting started. Jiru just knew Izuku would run off without them, but all that was important was for Shinso to stay on Izuku and not to lose the headband with 1 million on it. Mina was just happy to be involved in the chaos Izuku would cause. And Shinso hoped Izuku would be careful and not give him whiplash for being a passenger on his shoulder. He absent-mindedly how Izuku got his hair so soft as he patted it. Start! Almost every team rushed for Izuku's, but many began to get second thoughts when the whip arms snapped the air and collided with the ground, leaving craters where they impacted. Izuku's eager smile sealed the deal for many and they quickly turned around or attacked their neighbors. But not for Todoroki or Bakugo's team. Kachan flew off his team horse and rocketed toward Shinso. Izuku tried to grab him with one whip, but he saw it coming and blasted it away. Nice try. But Kachan forgot about the second one wrapping around his leg. Shit. He tried to blast it, but he was whipped back to his team and crashed hard into them. Stop saying bad words. Izuku yelled at his friend and focused back on Todoroki as Izuku's team began to move away from them. Kaminari shocks people, right? I don't like the idea of that, considering his bones were well conductors. Mina began to splash potent acid behind them to slow the team down. Todoroki froze the puddles, but they didn't stay frozen together with the strength of the acid. Jiru shot sonic waved at them and they backed off to target another team. Shinso kept his eyes open, but it seems that they were pretty well protected. They spent their time looping around the edge of the ring until someone tried to have a go at them. They were overwhelmed quickly by the range they had over the attacking team. One team with the front horse, being a hairy boy, charged at them with a large hand to slap them, but once Izuku focused on the hairy boy, he immediately turned around and ran with the confusion of his teammates. When they looked back at Izuku, he was beaming at them. The time limit was almost up when Todoroki's team began to charge at them again. Things got tricky when one of Izuku's whips got frozen in an iceberg and Todoroki's team charged at them only to stare in shock when Izuku's other whip grew a blade and sliced off the other stuck one to move freely. Some blood spilled, but it healed quickly and grew out of the previously missing whip. Izuku smiled at their discomfort at seeing his limb being lopped off without a care, and many in the crowd looked shocked as well. Todoroki tried to charge again, but his teammates began to hesitate at getting close to Izuku and his feral smile. Iida whispered something to his teammates and Izuku smiled even wider at Iida's stance and his teammates holding on to each other. Izuku did the same with grown tendrils and picked up Mina and Jiru to their very mild protest. Little heads up would be nice, Jiru said. Zuku, I didn't know you were into this stuff? Mina couldn't hold back a tease, but the looks she got from Shinso and Jiru made her blush more than usual. Into what? Izuku asked innocently, but was prepared for when Ida's pipes shot blue flames and sped up faster than ever before. Izuku watched them coming and tracked them as Todoroki tried to reach for Shinso's headbands, but Izuku moved out of the way, just as fast as Iida was to their shock. While dodging, one of Izuku's whips tried to grab for Todoroki's headband, but flames singed his tendrils and he backed away. Ow! Burns hurt, Izuku said, bringing his tendrils close to him to watch the flesh grow rapidly and the blackened flesh fall off. You okay, Izuku? Shinso asked. I'm fine, just a reflex of being burned is all. He set the two girls down and watched as Todoroki was dazed and his team disheartened by the failed pass. Iida more so than the others. They were distracted by Kacchan blasting toward them again. Time ticked down and Izuku beamed at his friend, trying to go at them again. Izuku's whip split again and again to grab the flying boy, but the end of the round came and Kacchan let himself be caught by the dozen bony tendrils. He was set down and grumbled about losing again to Izuku. His team celebrated the win and then Izuku went over to the iceberg with his whip frozen in it. He jumped onto it and broke the ice with one punch and retrieved his limb. It was absorbed back into his arm, but Izuku's stomach grumbled still. Nem called the winners for the round and called for the tournament to begin after lunch. Izuku joined with his friends to find food, with Shoji joining them. They found their dining area, and Izuku was the first to pile food onto his tray. He grabbed things he didn't know what they were, but Lunch Rush was more than happy to satisfy Izuku's hunger. He sat, and his friends joined him to eat. Once everyone began, Izuku devoured every morsel of food. Kacchan tried to berate him for eating too quickly but gave up when Izuku ignored him. Mina finished her plate and sneakily grabbed one of Izuku's skewed meat sticks. 2 more skewers were offered to her by tendrils, and Mina took them with a bashful smile. Izuku beamed at her and was happy to share with her. Shinso tried the same but was gently slapped away by a tendril. Favoritism, Shinso grumbled and got up for more food. Izuku sighed in relief and yawned. He still had time for the next round and decided to take a nap. He looked around and found the window looking out to the stadium. Under the window was a bench. He stretched and lay on the concrete bench and promptly went to sleep. Like a cat, he soaked in the sun and snored softly until the next round came. Mina held her mouth as Izuku curled up on the bench. She discreetly snapped a picture with her phone. She heard someone clear their throat and turned to see Jiro watching her with obvious amusement. Mina's ears burned but smiled anyway at her prize. Shinso shook his head at the pink girl and Shoji watched with his eyes crinkled with a smile. Izuku shifted into his back and his mouth opened wide in his sleep. Mina giggled as Izuku scratched his chest and snored loudly. Kacchan watched his friend and thought of his mother. He took his phone and snapped a picture for his mother. He got odd looks but he ignored them. Izuku woke with a large yawn that showed all his oddly perfect white teeth, for a boy who hasn't been to a dentist in a decade. He could call all the students who passed to the tournament to gather up for the brackets. He was greeted by his friend group with smiles aimed at him. He smiled back and hopped up and stretched again. Those who passed joined them and headed down to the field like Nem told them to do. Congratulations to the third round participants. She paused for the applause to die down. Now to see who will be fighting who. She aimed her whip at the large screen above her and the names spun into place for each person. Izuku vs Shinso, Mina vs Sato, Jiro vs Kendo, Todoroki vs Shiro, Yaoyorozu vs Shinshida, Iida vs Kacchan, Hiroshima vs Tetsu, Kaminari vs Shiozaki. Everyone stared up at the screen and Shinso was the first to speak next to Izuku. Well, fuck me sideways. He threw his hands up in the air and turned his head to the heavens. Don't say bad words. Mina giggled at the two's interactions. Izuku and Shinso walked into the arena with Nem telling them the rules of the match. Izuku was grinning in excitement at Shinso and his friend was grumbling to himself and had his arms crossed. I just want the record to state that I believe this is bullshit, Shinso said, trying to goad Izuku to say something. Izuku pouted at his friend but kept his mouth shut as Nem waved at them to start. When Shinso tried to say something again, Izuku bolted forward and he tried to leap out of the way. It was no use as Izuku wrapped him up in a few tendrils and picked him up. Shinso tried to struggle for a moment but went limp and gave up. With a sigh, Shinso tried to forfeit but a tendril wrapped around his mouth and he glared at the grinning Izuku. The beast of a boy walked over to the edge of the ring and set him gently outside the ring. Shinso kept his arms crossed and glared at Izuku the whole while. Shinso Hitoshi is out by ring out, Nem announced and the crowd clapped with many chuckles at the display of the first match. You're a dick, Shinso complained. Stop saying bad words, Izuku admonished his friend but couldn't contain his smile at the match. The two made their way out of the arena together and headed up to the student stands. Izuku was still excited to see everyone else fight as they sat down with Shoji and Shinso. Mina and Sato strolled up to the ring and the same process started as Nem explained the rules. The match started and Mina started to slide around while Sato tried to catch her. She lobbed blobs of acid at Sato as she glided around him. Sato began to slip with every step and the acid on him began to get more and more irritating as the seconds passed. With a grunt of frustration, Sato forfeited the match, and Mina ran up to Sato and poured more acid on him but the relief on his face was evident. Izuku was mimicking the others and cheered for Mina as she waved at the crowd and headed off the ring. She arrived at the stands with Sato and she sat next to Izuku. He gave her congratulations and a beaming smile. Mina giggled at his enthusiasm and then watched the next match with Jiro against Kendo. It was a pretty straightforward match since Kendo just had to catch Jiro and toss her out of the ring. Jiro tried to make Kendo release her by using her earlobes but it only made Kendo throw her out faster. Todoroki's match with Shiro was very interesting and anticlimactic. An ice glacier sprung up covering Shiro and sticking out of the stadium. Why are they saying, "Nice try," to Shiro? He lost horribly, Izuku asked his friend. Mina snorted and Shinso explained. They are trying to sympathize with Shiro. Not many people would have been able to win when something like that was thrown at them. Izuku shrugged and kinda understood so he let it pass. Todoroki melted the mass and the next match started. A hairy teen from the other class was against Yaoyorozu but the boy was shifting uncomfortably as they waited for the match to start. The boy didn't speak much and immediately charged forward when they started. Yaoyorozu made a staff but she was yanked to the side by Shinshida in his transformed state. The staff was yanked out of her hands and she was tossed out of the ring quickly. Izuku could smell the dried tears on Yaoyorozu and the disappointment when she sat with them. Izuku didn't like that and turned around. Hey, Yaoyorozu, why didn't you make a gun in your match? Yaoyorozu raised her eyebrows in surprise and shook her head. I wanted to show my ability to use my staff but as you can see it didn't go well. Izuku smelled more of that disappointment. You could have just beat the hairy guy with something better and then show off your stick skills against someone else. She smiled at him. I should have thought about that. She appreciated his attempt to cheer her up. And stick skills, she giggled. Are they the same as the eating sticks? Mina laughed. Eating sticks? You mean chopsticks? Yaoyorozu furrowed her brow but her smile didn't leave her face. I still don't know how to use them. They don't make sense. Why not just use a fork? Izuku grumbled. Can you even use a fork? Shinso jabbed. Shut up. I'm learning, Izuku said indignantly. Then how the hell did you eat at my house? Kachan asked with a slight scowl. No bad words. He pointed at Kachan and the blonde shook his head and headed down to the ring. I cheated by making a small tendril under the spoon. He smiled proudly at everyone. You don't know how to use utensils. That makes sense. I can make you a set to practice if you like. Yaoyorozu offered. Izuku shrugged. Sure. I think I will stick to sandwiches though but I wanna learn how. She smiled at him and produced a wooden box. He slid it open and a set of beautiful utensils were inside. I made them very durable, she said proudly. Izuku's eyes gleamed as he gently pulled out the utensils. Thanks, Yaoyorozu. He beamed at her and she smiled warmly at the feral boy. Their attention was drawn to the arena when an explosion was set off and Iida was sent sprawling. He got back up and charged forward again as Kachan made a smoke screen and moved around the attacking speedster. An explosion to his back sent him out of the ring and the match was over. The next two matches were very boring for different reasons. The two boys just beat each other with no change and both dropped at the same time. The fight between Kaminari and Shiozaki ended in 2 minutes as Kaminari stood dumbly with his most powerful attack negated. He was quickly wrapped up in vines and they called the match. Izuku shifted from foot to foot as he waited for his opponent to walk out of the tunnel. Nem looked at him warmly at his behavior and then turned professional when Shinshida walked out with his head bowed. His hands were trembling and his steps were uneven. Izuku reined in his excitement and watched the extremely nervous boy on the other side of the ring. Nem started the match and everyone quieted down when no one moved. Izuku furrowed his brow and then slapped his forehead in realization. Nem, what's his name? The other boy flinched at the sudden noise. Shinshida Jirota. Nem smiled at him. Shin, I want you to give me a good fight. And we can be friends too. Izuku shouted out to the confusion of everyone in the stands except for 1A. Shinshida's shoulders slumped in relief and looked up tentatively. What is the quirk that you possess that allows you to make me feel this primal fear? I'm not sure why that happens, I forgot until now actually. Shinso said it's because I was raised by wolves, but that doesn't make sense since they tried to eat me like. He paused and counted slowly on his hand. 4 times. Anyways, give me a good fight. Izuku dropped into a crouch and waited for his opponent. There were murmured conversations going through the crowd and Shinshida looked just as thrown off as everyone else was at his words. He shook his head and focused on the present. I will endeavor to do my best. His gym uniform stretched as he grew larger and let out a snarl. Izuku's smile could only be defined as feral as the fight began. He still waited, he was very patient, to see how the boy fought and how fast he was. Shinshida charged on all fours at Izuku and swung his large hand at Izuku. He dodged underneath and moved around Shinshida's bulk. Izuku jabbed at his exposed side and the beastly boy roared in pain and slammed his arm down on the ground where Izuku was at. The true beast of a boy giggled in joy at fighting a large opponent. Some joy was lost as he couldn't hunt him even though he looks like a bear. He promised himself one day he will hunt a bear. He was drawn out of his thoughts as Shinshida began to swing wildly at Izuku. He dodged every swing of the massive arms and countered when he saw an opening. A strike to the knee caused Shinshida to stumble, a hit to the back of his elbow caused him to favor the other arm, and a punch to the chest caused him to lose the air in his lungs. Shinshida roared again and bull-rushed Izuku. Izuku's smile never left as he nimbly jumped over the charging teen and waited for him to stop. Shinshida was huffing large breaths as he wildly looked around for Izuku. He found where Izuku was by the sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking. It didn't matter how fast he turned as all he caught a glimpse of was the spear-tipped tail and then he was face down with a heavy weight on his back. He felt the razor claws on his neck and hear the bony tail move above his head. He froze on instinct and let out a shaky breath. I surrender, Shinshida said and felt the weight get off his back with the horrible sounds of Izuku's quirk working. The crowd cheered at the fight between beasts and cheered more when Izuku helped a shrunken Shinshida to his feet. You're good. Great fight. Izuku beamed at his opponent. Shinshida huffed and smiled back. I stood no chance against you at your full transformation. He furrowed his brow and asked. What did you mean earlier about the wolves raising you? Just as Izuku was going to tell his life story to another person without a care in the world, Nem called them. Clear the arena, boys. She smiled at the two. Apologies. Shinshida bowed slightly and turned to the green-haired boy only to see him climbing up the arena wall to the 1A stands. Maybe another time then. Izuku jumped over the railing to see Shinso shaking his head at Izuku. You were about to tell him about before Ua, weren't you? So, Izuku shrugged. It's not like I'm keeping it a secret, you're the one who didn't tell his mom that a feral boy was living in the woods behind their house. He snarked with a grin. I was 13. I just assumed you wanted to be left alone in the woods. He defended himself with pink cheeks. Everyone in their section of seating turned to the wall where Monoma was peeking over to ask something but was stopped when he heard what Shinso and Izuku were saying. Oh boy, does he have a story to tell you? Mina laughed loudly. When I was 5, if you want to tell him, do it later. Shinso cut Izuku off. Okay, I'll tell you later, Monoma. Izuku smiled at his friend and looked worried and confused at what was going on. All right. He nodded and slowly sunk behind the divider. Izuku, why do you care so little about telling others something so personal about yourself? Sue asked. He shrugged. I don't see why I should keep it a secret. That's fair. Sue nodded and turned back to the front where Kendo and Todoroki walked into the arena. Kendo lasted longer than Shiro by using her fists to break the smaller glaciers Todoroki sent out. But in the end, she was overwhelmed and frozen up to her chest. Izuku noticed Todoroki shivering at the end of the match as he thawed out Kendo. Izuku hummed in thought and his friends looked at him in question. What happens when someone uses only one part of their quirk and not the other? It will naturally atrophy. Why? Yaoyorozu said immediately. Because Todoroki is shivering and looks pale. He pointed at the boy in the arena. They all saw what Izuku was pointing at and it was very evident to everyone. That's concerning, Yaoyorozu said and everyone nodded their agreement. The next match was Kachan against Kirishima. It was very one-sided with Kirishima turtling up and bracing against the onslaught of attacks Kachan sent out. It was only a matter of time until Kirishima couldn't hold on any longer and was knocked out by the strain of holding his quirk. The match with Mina against Shiozaki was similar to the last one, but instead of the attacker gaining ground it was Shiozaki's vines slowly encroaching on Mina. She frantically tried to throw more acid but more and more vines crawled at her until she didn't notice she stepped out of the ring. She was frustrated as she left the arena but was somewhat happy to have made it so far. Izuku made his way down the tunnels and was almost there when he smelled something weird. A large man with a fire beard and a weird outfit was walking down the tunnel. Izuku saw the costume and immediately recognized him to be a hero. The hero stopped and waited for Izuku to stop, but Izuku didn't know who he was and walked around him. It's disrespectful to ignore your elder. Endeavor growled out. Izuku turned around and tilted his head in confusion. But you're not my elder. I don't think I have any. He thought about it and maybe he could consider Nezu as an elder, but he was too scared of Izuku. Endeavor stared at the boy in growing confusion. You are Izuku Kayama, yet you do not have any resemblance to Midnight. Oh, Nem. I just asked her for her family name since I didn't like mine anymore and she was happy to let me have it. No, my mother is in jail. Endeavor furrowed his brow in more confusion. Well, I gotta go. See y'all later, Flame Beard. Izuku turned around and walked down the tunnel again. Izuku practically skipped to the arena and met eyes with Todoroki across the concrete. You're still shivering, that's bad. Izuku pointed out. I will beat you with my ice only. Todoroki growled and sent out a smaller glacier at Izuku. He jumped over it and landed closer to him but didn't move anymore. He frowned. That was slow and smaller. Izuku absent-mindedly took a chunk of ice and began to chew on it. It crunched in his mouth easily. Shut up and fight. Todoroki sent another wave of ice but Izuku moved around it casually. Stop playing around. Izuku let out a huff and cracked the concrete under his feet as he leapt at Todoroki with full force. His eyes widened as he had no time to do anything. Izuku grabbed Todoroki by the shirt and threw him violently to the center of the arena. Todoroki landed and bounced against the ice he created. Izuku looked down at his arm and saw some ice covering it from where Todoroki tried to use his quirk on him. Izuku took the ice off his arm and began to munch on it. Todoroki got up shakily and glared at Izuku, who chewed on the ice. Izuku looked at Todoroki and then Nem for guidance at the weak opposition. She gave a helpless shrug and Izuku made a face of frustration. You should just give up. You won't win like this. Maybe if I was fighting you in the first match, but not how you are now. Izuku shook his head and stood in the way of the wave of ice to prove a point. It covered his legs up to his knees and stopped. Todoroki tried to send more out but it was slow to crawl up Izuku's leg. He backhanded the ice around his legs and it shattered and Izuku walked out. Izuku frowned even more as Todoroki shivered even more and ice built on his body. You can use fire for part of your quirk, don't you? Why not use it? Izuku asked as the crowd was beginning to get bored at the match. You wouldn't understand. He shouted back. Izuku threw his hands up and shouted back. No, I don't. He bolted forward and picked up Todoroki with a bony whip from his hand. You're going to hurt yourself if we keep going. Ice crawled on the whip around his waist and gently set him outside the ring. Todoroki went limp in Izuku's grasp and he looked worriedly at Todoroki. He helped the cold boy to the nurse's station he never needed until now. The cheers from the crowd were very scattered as they left the ice to be cleaned up. Once they were in the tunnels, Izuku asked, "Are you not allowed to use the other part of your quirk?" "I wanted to prove to my father that I don't need his fire to be a hero, I failed," he said softly and still shivering. Izuku frowned. "His fire? What do you mean? My father created me to surpass all might," he admitted and moved to a bench in the tunnels. He sat down and Izuku sat next to him. "You probably will, everyone will in time. I mean he is old, isn't he? But that still doesn't explain why you won't use your fire." Todoroki gave a minuscule grin at that but frowned at the question. "My father trained me for years but he is not a good man. I wanted to be a hero using only my ice as if that will separate me from him." "Who is he?" "Endeavor, the number 2 hero under All Might." Izuku nodded and then shook his head. "I don't know who that is. I'm sorry but I don't understand. Maybe you should talk to someone in your family. A mother or siblings if you have them. Or you can talk to Nem, she's offered to talk about my feeling about my mother. Maybe that can help, but I think you should use your quirk to its fullest because it's yours and no one else's." Izuku nodded with determination at his words. Todoroki stared at him and let the words sink in. He stared at his pale hands and then at a gentle flame that appeared at his palm. Slowly the flame grew to cover his hand and he turned to see Izuku beaming at Todoroki. He smiled back at his classmate's behavior. "I will think more about what you have said. Thank you, Izuku," Todoroki said standing up. "Anytime. I'm happy to help." Izuku stood with a smile. "You should still go to the nurse's station. I get it if you don't want to, I don't like her much either." Todoroki gave him a befuddled look and huffed a small laugh. He walked off and Izuku stood there until he heard an explosion. He began to run down the tunnel to see if he could catch the match with Kacchan and Vine Girl. Izuku caught the end of the match between Kacchan and Shiozaki. The first thing he sees is Kacchan in the air and then a large explosion shot at Shiozaki, who was in a cocoon of vines. They stood no chance as he burned through all of them and was able to get a hold of Shiozaki by the head. She surrendered quickly after that, and then Kacchan gently extracted his hand from her hair. The crowd cheered at the display and then cheered even more when Kacchan offered his hand to the girl. She took it gratefully, and they walked off the arena. They called a 20-minute break for Kacchan to rest after his match. Izuku wasn't bothered by waiting and walked out to the arena to the surprise of everyone. He found a nice patch of grass and laid down for a 20-minute nap. He was unsatisfied with his sleeping arrangements and dug up some dirt to pile it up as a pillow. He set the patch of grass over it and then began to drift off in his nap. Everyone who was watching the UA Sports Festival just witnessed Izuku Kayama, one of the oddest students, lying down in front of everyone and going to sleep without a care in the world. Shinso was shaking his head at the shamelessness of his friend while admiring it just a bit. Mina giggled and internally squealed at the precious sight of Izuku sleeping. "You sure he isn't related to you? He apparently can sleep anywhere at the drop of a hat." Present Mike laughed softly in the commentator's box. "Shut up, Hizashi," Aizawa said from the ground as he tried to do the same as the feral child. Nem couldn't contain her giggle as she watched Izuku roll onto his back and snore loudly. "He's so adorable. He's a very contrasting person. 1 minute, he is an apex predator, and the next, he is taking a cat nap in front of millions. But, I do have to agree that he looks quite adorable," Smintos said from his perch. The crowd murmured as Izuku slept for a bit longer. They all had their minds on the very odd boy in the field. When it was getting close to starting up again, Nem went over to his sleeping form and tickled his nose with her whip. Izuku batted it away and snored loudly as he turned over. Nem sighed with a smile to the heavens. She crouched down next to him and tapped his shoulder. Izuku sniffed. "Nem, your nap is over, time to get up." She smiled. "Right." Izuku sat up and yawned, exposing too many teeth. He stretched and bones cracked. With a sigh of relief, he stood up and looked around. He smiled at Nem and followed her to the ring. Izuku sat on his side and leaned left to right in anticipation. "The finals are to begin. Find your seats and get ready to see the fight of the year." Present Mike shouted through the speakers. He got a glare from Izuku for being too loud. A few minutes later, Nem called Kacchan into the ring. He showed up and immediately stared at the patch of ground that was dug up by Izuku. He raises an eyebrow at his old friend and he got a grin in return. Tendrils pushed Izuku off the ground and he hopped from foot to foot with an eager smile. "You ready?" Kacchan asked with his palms sparking. Izuku nodded and stilled. He crouched down and prepared for what Kacchan would throw at him. He had some ideas he could use against him, but for now, he wanted to see how well he fought in person. "Start!" Nem shouted and backed away. The two didn't move right away and stared at each other with similar feral grins. Izuku's was more genuine. Kacchan couldn't wait any longer and blasted forward as Izuku stood his ground. He dodged the series of explosions aimed at him with ease. He was getting burned slightly from close calls, but he could heal that with little energy. Kacchan tried to trick him by blasting his front and instead, a smokescreen popped out of his hand. Izuku didn't take the bait and grabbed Kacchan's leg while he tried to move over Izuku to get at his back. Izuku threw Kacchan by the leg back to the center of the arena. Kacchan reoriented himself in the air and landed. The cheers of the crowd were almost deafening. Kacchan took in a breath and stared at Izuku across the ring. He smiled and then Kacchan rushed back. Izuku did the same and met the large explosion head-on. Kacchan worried when he heard bones crack and flesh tear. He didn't want to truly hurt Izuku. But his worries were for nothing. Emerging from the smoke was Izuku. He was different from his usual form. He still had his 4 eyes, but instead, his mouth was covered by a bone plate like a knight. It reached up to his nose and covered his chin from both sides. Like the plates came from his jawline and met in the middle. The exposed skin was now covered in rough scales. His arms were the same except for the keratin shields on his forearms that could cover his chest put together. His hands were still the same claws but blunted to avoid seriously injuring Kacchan. His legs were also scaled and larger for more speed and 4 tendrils extended from his back. They moved lazily around in the air, ready to snap at their targets. The crowd hollered in excitement at seeing the display and Izuku chucked in excitement. The layered voices were muffled by the protective shield on his face. Kacchan stared at all of Izuku and immediately thought, his quirk is so bullshit. Izuku was the first to make a move and charged forward. His claws dug out furrows into the ring as he ran on all 4s. Kacchan blasted upwards to avoid his charge but was too slow as one of the tendrils grabbed onto his waist and yanked him down. He blasted the tendril and he was released. He slammed into the ground and skipped twice before he righted himself. Izuku was already on him and Kacchan sent out a flashbang at point-blank range. Izuku roared in pain but composed himself quickly as his eyes were replaced instead of healed for speed. As Kacchan got some distance, Izuku changed his body and a bone dome covered his eyes. Minuscule heat pits opened around his body and he used them for his eyes. Now, Izuku's face was completely covered with bone. Kacchan rushed at him and Izuku blocked the blast with his shield. He was batted back with a quick swipe of the other arm and Izuku rushed at him again. Kacchan was thrown around but he didn't give up. The scales were charred and healed multiple times and his tendrils were blasted off a few times. Kacchan backed away after an exchange and stood taking in breaths. He smiled at Izuku and rose into the sky. Once high enough, he began to spin and create a vortex of heat aimed right at Izuku. For his part, the dome pulled back and he stared at the Kacchan rocketing at him. His feral grin was hidden by the bone plates. Izuku's tendrils slammed into the ground behind him and grew thicker to anchor himself. He slammed his keratin shields together and they grew to cover his body. They dug into the ground and Izuku's dome slammed closed and he prepared to take the explosion head-on. The crowd watched in battered silence as Kacchan's fireball impacted again the shield. Smoke covered the area for a moment and then Kacchan was visible with his palm against the now blackened shield. It was cracking apart and then it opened to show Izuku smiling. Kacchan's face was enveloped by his large hand and tendrils took hold of Kacchan's hands. He hung there and struggled but Izuku had won. "Fuck, I forfeit." Kacchan cursed loudly. "Stop saying bad words." A dozen voices from one mouth shouted at Kacchan just before the cheers exploded. Izuku Kayama is the winner of the first year's sports festival. Nem shouted into the microphone. Izuku set his friend down and his body shifted back to normal. Scales were sucked in and bone plates followed. The blackened keratin was absorbed with no issue and Izuku put the burnt material to good use. Kacchan stumbled a bit and Izuku steadied him. You could have won faster if you were fighting as you did against the Nomu, Kacchan grumbled. Of course, I could have. But I didn't want to kill you. Izuku smiled lopsidedly. Kacchan gave out a grunt of laughter. I suppose that's good then. They made their way off the stage and Izuku helped Kacchan to the nurse's station. Once he was there, Izuku left him with the old lady to find some food. He used up a lot of energy that day. He heard sounds from down the hall and saw Mina rushing down with Shinso, Jiro, and Shoji walking behind her. Congratulations. You won. Mina squealed and jumped for joy. You looked so cool too. Like a tank, but you were so quick too. You did look badass. Jiro agreed. Thanks. I'm kinda hungry. Let's go find some food. Izuku beamed at his friends and made to leave. Mina skidded as she tried to stop Izuku. Hold on. You still need to do the award ceremony. Award ceremony, Izuku said slowly as if he was tasting the words. Of course. He nodded along. You have no idea what that is, do you? Shinso asked. No, not a clue. Izuku shook his head. Mina giggled and jumped on his back. He didn't move an inch. Let's go. You'll see. Izuku beamed up at Mina on his back and began to walk where they directed. Kacchan caught up to them and waited as everything was set up. Todoroki and Shiozaki approached them and stood near them. Todoroki gave Izuku a faint smile and a nod. Izuku beamed in response. Shiozaki observed Izuku as they waited. Izuku caught her staring and waved in greeting. She smiled and nodded. Nem approached them and directed them to where to stand. Izuku followed instructions and stared out at everyone in the stands. What's the point of this? Izuku asked Kacchan next to him. Shiozaki gave him an odd look but Kacchan responded. It's to show the top places for people to take pictures or shit like that. He was bopped on the head. Stop it, Izuku commanded. Fuck you. Kacchan grabbed the tendril and pulled. The tendril was detached and Kacchan stumbled. He stared at the wriggling tendril with disgust and threw it away. Hey, Izuku grabbed it before it was thrown into the grass. I'm going to tell Auntie Suki that you are saying bad words. He threatened. Just as Kacchan was going to say something, Nem began the ceremony, the top 3 of the tournament, and to hand out the medals. None other than All Might. The crowd cheered even louder as All Might landed with a thud. I am here. He began with 3rd place and handed bronze medals to each one of them. After some words of encouragement, he moved on to Kacchan. He places a silver medal on his neck and patted his shoulder. Then it was Izuku's turn. What's the point of that? All Might chuckled and placed a gold medal around his neck. They're trophies. Izuku's eyes shone at the word and clutched his newest trophy in his hands. He has now understood the reason for the ceremony, for trophies. This goes next to the deer skull from 2 weeks ago. Shiozaki furrowed her brow but relaxed when she explained it to herself as he was a traditional hunter. You did incredibly well. Your skills to adapt to any opponent is a valuable asset to have. Do your best to work on that and keep that smile as best you can. All Might gave him a brief hug and Izuku returned it in a smile. The ceremony ended and Izuku strolled down the tunnels with his group of friends. He was very happy as he played with his newest trophy. They chatted about where to go to eat when they came across someone in the middle of the tunnel in front of them. A woman a bit shorter than Izuku with white hair and tanned skin trembled slightly and tried to make eye contact with Izuku. Hello, Izuku greeted. You a hero? Izuku was sure she was one since she was dressed oddly. That's Mirko. Mina squealed but it died down when the hero was acting odd. Hello, Mirko. Nice to meet you. Are you okay? Izuku asked and stepped forward. Mirko stepped back and her face reddened both in embarrassment and anger. She gritted her teeth and tried to stand her ground. She couldn't contain herself and she leapt back in a crouched position. What the hell? She yelled. Don't say bad words. Izuku admonished the hero and caught sight of the rabbit's ears flat against her head. Oh, you have an animal quirk. I mean you no harm. He beamed. Mirko's eyes snapped onto his and she gave a feral grin. Like some pipsqueak can harm me. Her eyes were filled with fire. Of course, I can harm you. Izuku tilted his head in confusion at the odd woman. And what's a pipsqueak? Izuku turned to Shinso, but he was staring at Izuku like he was insane. What? Oh ho ho ho, I like you, I'll be watching you. Mirko laughed and backed away. Okay, bye Mirko. Izuku waved. She was a weird bunny lady. He said more to himself. Mirko, the number 5 hero, was affected by your weird thing just like anyone else, Juro said in a daze. She was number 5, huh, I already met number 1. Now to meet the rest of the top 10. Izuku made a goal on the spot and began to walk ahead. The others looked at each other and Shinso shook his head in exasperation. When they got out of the stadium and its tunnels, they got changed and meet up again to get something to eat. Before they left, Izuku remembered something. Oh right, Mina. Izuku turned to the pink girl next to him. Hold on. Shinso stopped him and pulled Juro and Shoji away. Go ahead. Izuku furrowed his brow in confusion but shrugged and turned to Mina's confused look. I want to take you out on a date to make you my girlfriend, Izuku said bluntly. Mina stopped to process what he asked of her and then her face bloomed in heat. You are asking me out. Juro, Shoji, and Shinso heard clearly. Izuku nodded with a smile. Yep, wait, do you know what it means to have a girlfriend? Mina's face was completely purple but had to ask. Izuku tilted his head and answered. Yay, it means we become romantic partners with the end goal to get married and having a family in the future. Married. Mina blushed even harder. That was healthy. Way in the future. Izuku waved slowly. Mina stopped to calm herself and breathe. What do you think romantic partners do together? Izuku shrugged. Nem taught me to do whatever we are both comfortable with. Mina began to get excited but held herself together. And what would we do on our date? I was thinking of going to an arcade like you said you liked. Then go eat at a nice place, Kachan told me that one. And then we could do something else, maybe choose when we are there. Izuku nodded at his decision. What would you be comfortable with me doing? Mina began to get close and then grabbed his hand. She looked at him to see his reaction and he smiled warmly at her. She got closer and hugged him. He hugged back. She got close to his face and then backed off. Too much. I'll go on a date with you. And then she grabbed Juro on the way and ran off with her. Izuku watched her go with Juro stumbling along. Was that normal? Shinso shrugged and Shoji did the same. Don't ask us, we're maidenless, Shinso said. Well, I'm still hungry. Where should we go to eat? Izuku's stomach grumbled and he looked around for some food. The other two shook their head at Izuku's ability to switch focus so easily. Shinso led them to a small diner. The owners were happy to have some of the participants in the sports festival and sat them down immediately. Izuku ordered a large burger that was on the menu specifically for big eaters. So, you asked Mina out then? Shinso asked when they ordered their food. I told you I was going to do it. He tilted his head in confusion. You were attracted to her? Shoji asked just as bluntly at Izuku. He had learned it was the easiest way to talk with him. Izuku nodded. I think she is very pretty and I like her unique appearance. She is very fun to be around and I didn't like it when she called me scared. I want to change that. Called you? When? Shinso asked confused. The night after the USJ. She had a nightmare and called me to calm down. Boyfriends protect their girlfriends, I want to do that too. If you are sure, Shoji said with a shrug. Do you have clothes for a nice dinner? Izuku nodded. Nem took me shopping for a lot of clothes. Too many I think. The food came and Izuku salivated at the smell of his 2-pound burger. The owners were overjoyed at seeing Izuku devour his meal and asked for another. Mina stopped a few blocks away from Ua with Juro glaring at her for almost dragging her along and smirking at being asked out on a date. How much did you hear? Mina asked weakly. I tried not to listen but after you shouted, I couldn't help myself. So, you've got a date with a feral boy. She teased and poked Mina with her earlobes. She batted them away and covered her face. I know, I was starting to get a crush on him but he jumped the gun on me. Not that I mind. She smiled to herself. You think he really understands what he is asking for? Juro asked. Mina thought about it and nodded slowly. I think so. He isn't stupid, he would have asked questions of others about dating. He even mentioned it by bringing up Midnight and Bakugo. And him wanting to get married. She smiled. Mina blushed at the mere thought. He said way in the future. She stuttered out. But you're not opposed. Juro teased. I'm way too young to have a husband. She shrieked. Juro burst out laughing as others on the street heard her and Mina blushed in embarrassment. Izuku returned to his den and placed the gold medal on the antlers of a deer skull he liked. He shifted it and nodded in satisfaction. He shifted in his furs and laid down for some sleep. He spent the morning after the sports festival looking up places to go eat with Mina on his date. He had trouble finding where to go search on his phone and gave up. He changed and went inside to look for Nem. He walked down the halls and opened the door to the teacher's lounge. Nem. What do you need, kiddo? She smiled at seeing him. How do I search for nice places to eat on my phone? And other places too. Nem chuckled and took the phone from his hands. She walked him through the process of finding the application for either the map or a search engine. Why did you want to know? She asked after she handed his phone back. Izuku tapped with his tendrils to search for the date locations. To take Mina out to eat. He answered. Nem froze for a moment and then giggled. Oh, do you have a date? She teased and the others in the room shook their heads at the fruitless effort. Yep, thanks, Nem. Izuku beamed for her help and began to walk out. A whip wrapped around his waist and pulled him back. What do you mean you have a date? And with Mina? Did she ask you? She rattled off. I asked Mina on a date yesterday and she said yes, Izuku confirmed. Hey, Izuku, do you know what it means to go out on a date? And what comes from that? Present Mike asked gently. It would mean she would be my girlfriend and the end goal would be to get married and have a family with her. But that's around your age I think. Also just because we are dating doesn't mean we are getting married, I think that's everything. Izuku thought for a moment. Oh, and only do things you and your partner are comfortable with. He nodded with a smile. Present Mike nodded and shrugged. He's got the outline, he's good. Do you know what to do on a date? Snipe asked. Izuku hummed in thought. Talk to her and have fun. Oh yay, he's got it in the bag. Snipe agreed with Mike. Wait. What about your clothes? Where will you be taking her? When is it? Will you need help getting there? Nem mothered him to the amusement of everyone in the room. I've got clothes. We'll be going to a restaurant, that's why I'm looking it up. An arcade and then I don't know after. When? I'm not sure I'll ask and with this map app I think I can figure it out. Izuku rattled off answers back. Leave the boy be, he's got it handled. If he needs help he'll ask like now. Snipe said to Nem. Nem looked apprehensive but nodded. Let me help with the clothes at least. She stood and was sat down by Snipe. Go on, kiddo, you still need to get ready and don't go out too late. Snipe shooed him off. I won't, thanks, guys. He beamed and jogged off to his room. Izuku got to his room and sifted through his closet to look for something appropriate for the date. He took a pair of nicer looking shorts and a button-up shirt he remembered Nem said was for casual formal. He nodded in satisfaction and cleaned up in the shower with the scentless soap. When he was done, he began to scour the local area for nice restaurants and an arcade. A few hours later, Izuku waited in front of the train station for Mina to arrive. He had the route memorized and also on his phone to follow along. The restaurant required a reservation, and after looking up what that meant, he did so. A train arrived and the doors opened for many people to get off. Mina was one of them and she looked around to find him. She bounded over to him after seeing him and then she twirled around to show Izuku her clothes. What do you think? She asked smiling. She had a pair of skinny jeans, a nice shirt, and a light jacket. You look very pretty, he said beaming with a smile. Mina blushed but smiled as well. She took his arm in hers and began to walk off the station. You look good too, where are we going? A restaurant that I found that looked nice, I guess. It's. Izuku looked around for a moment and oriented himself. That way, he began to lead the way. Mina giggled and they began to walk at a leisurely pace. This your first time going out like this? Yep, you're the first girl I've asked out. Mina laughed. I figured, but that's not what I meant. Is this your first time going into the city? The only times I've gone was when Nem took me shopping for clothes or when we went to eat somewhere. Do you go into the city a lot? He turned to Mina. Sometimes, it's been a while since I've been so busy with school. But I'm excited for today. She hugged Izuku's arm. I'm happy to hear that. He smiled. After a bit, they arrived at the restaurant. Mina looked around impressed at the location and they were seated immediately after Izuku gave his name. There was quiet chatter but it wasn't some rich place for high-profile people. This is super nice, how'd you find it? Mina sat across from Izuku with her jacket on the backrest. The app on my phone. I just typed in, Nice restaurants, and found this one. Izuku also looked around at the decor and people. Was this right for a date? Izuku turned to Mina with a tilt of his head. Mina smiled and nodded. It's a pretty good choice. It doesn't always have to be fancy but this is nice. The server brought the menus and they looked through the options. Izuku found that they served meat and found a large steak. He smiled and set the menu to the side. Mina did the same and they began to chat away the time. Mina told him about her favorite movies and what things she usually does while at home. Izuku mainly listened and asked questions when he didn't understand something. Their meals came and Izuku just about salivated. A monster of a steak was set in front of Izuku and a smaller steak was set in front of Mina. They grinned at each other at having similar thoughts and dug in. Izuku had to use a fork and knife since it was a public place but he cheated by extending tendrils to his utensils. The knife was dull so he covered it with his tendril and his blade slid through the rare steak like butter. They chatted between bites and had a nice late lunch. Mina giggled when she caught Izuku taking bites out of the bone and laughed harder when one of the staff caught him. After paying, they walked out of the restaurant content and Izuku led them around a near park. Mina pulled Izuku to it and they sat down under a tree's shade. Izuku smiled at the groan from Mina being too full. They sat in silence while the wind blew. Mina tapped on Izuku's arm to get his attention. Why did you ask me out? I'm happy that you did but I'm curious why. Izuku hummed in thought and tried to figure out how to explain his reasoning. When you called me after the USJ, I didn't like to see you scared like that. I wanted to go and protect you from your nightmare even though I couldn't. So, I want to be your mate that protects you from what I can. Izuku said with resolve. Mina listened and her face bloomed in heat when Izuku called her his mate but understood what he was trying to say. And you like me, not just friends but more than that. It's not just you being protective. I find you very pretty and I like to talk to you all the time. I like you more than a friend like you said. Mina smiled at the compliments and leaned her head on his shoulder. I like to be around you too. She looked up and pecked his cheek. Izuku beamed at the contact and felt warmth fill him at the kiss. He hummed in contentment and grabbed Mina's hand experimentally. She intertwined her fingers with his and they sat happily for a while longer. Do you still want to go to the arcade? Izuku asked. Yes. Is there one nearby? Izuku nodded. He got up and held out his hand to Mina. She took it with a grin and they made their way to the arcade hand in hand. It took Izuku a second to find where he was in his mental map and began to lead Mina to the arcade he had found on his phone. When they got there, it had a few others around their age. Izuku looked around in wonder at all the flashing lights. Mina giggled at his reaction and led him around to see everything. She took some cash she had stashed somewhere and traded it for coins. It's simple. Push these buttons to fire your weapons and this stick to move around. Your objective is to get as far as you can while destroying other ships. Mina played the first round to show him how to start. Izuku's eyes were glued to the screen and flickered to her hands pushing buttons. His other set of eyes opened to see both at the same time. When she got hit one too many times, she lost and stepped to the side for Izuku to try. She gave him an encouraging smile and he stepped in her place. While Izuku got frustrated at losing so many times, he did enjoy hearing Mina laugh and encourage him where she could. She pulled him away from that game and to another to try out. It was enlightening to play around in the arcade. When it was beginning to get dark, Mina pulled him to another game. This one had platforms to step on and lights lit up under the platform. This one is one of my favorites. All you do is push the buttons that match up on the screen at the right time with your feet. She stepped onto the platform and motioned Izuku to step next to her. He gingerly did so, worried about his weight but the surface was solid and didn't give. Mina nodded and she put in the coins to start. She selected the difficulty and a song and then it started. Izuku missed a few in the beginning, but he learned the timing and was able to hit every step just as Mina did. She laughed in joy and they finished the round. "Wanna try a harder difficulty?" Mina beamed and Izuku nodded, enjoying the game. She selected the next difficulty and the arrows came faster than before. The same process began again and he got the rhythm of the song and the arrows. The game ended and Mina had the high score. "Ah, I guess we should be headed out now." Mina looked outside to see the sun getting lower and lower. "All right," Izuku nodded. They walked side by side to the train station. "How did you like the arcade?" Mina asked after a bit. "It was fun, annoying that I lost so many times though," Izuku grumbled. Mina giggled and took his hand in hers. "I'm glad you had fun." "Did you have fun?" "Lots. We'd have to do it again sometime." She bumped her shoulder with his and he beamed a smile to her. They sat on a bench waiting for the next train to arrive. Mina pulled her phone out and held it at arm's length away. She poked Izuku to look and snapped a few pictures. She smiled at his face in the picture and sent it to him. When the train arrived, they got up and he walked her to it. She boarded after kissing Izuku on the cheek. He smiled again and watched her leave. Once the train was gone, Izuku turned back to head to his den. He got off the station and was immediately lost on how to get to Ua. Luckily, Nem predicted this and showed him how to set the course to home on his phone's map. He began to remember the path once he saw familiar locations. He walked through the gates without issue and made his way to his room to change and then his den. He was about to lie down when he got a message from Mina saying that she was home and she will see him when school starts again with a small picture of hearts. He sent one back of enjoying their time together and snuggled into his furs for sleep. The weekend passed with the occasional conversation with Mina and sometimes Shinso, but nothing of note happened. The morning when school was supposed to begin again, Izuku cooked up his breakfast and then made his way to the classroom. He was one of the first ones there with Todoroki and Yaoyorozu seated quietly. He waved at each of them and they did the same. Todoroki even gave him a small smile. The class filled and then Mina walked in and smiled at Izuku and made her way over to him. She sat on his desk. "How was your weekend?" "Great. And you?" "UHHG, get a room." Shinso groaned behind Izuku. "Why?" Izuku asked in confusion. Shinso sputtered and Kachan barked out a laugh. "Yay, eyebags. Why would they need to get a room?" "Get to your seats," Aizawa said and everyone appeared where they belong. He was clear of bandages and only had a scar under his eye as a reminder of the USJ. The purpose of the sports festival is to get you all invited by heroes to intern under them to have some on-the-field experience. He pulled up a screen showing numbers by most people's names. Izuku had 59 next to his. He got a few papers with names of possible heroes he could go intern with. Izuku read the names but had no clue who was who. "Find a hero you would like to intern under and fill out the form," Aizawa said. "Aizawa, I don't know who anyone is." Izuku pointed at the names. Aizawa let out a long-suffering sigh and turned to the feral child. "You have a phone, look them up." "Right, I can do that." Izuku pulled his phone out and began to look up the first name on the list. "Later, you feral brat. You all will be deciding on your hero codename," Aizawa drawled. The door slammed open and Nem strolled in. "And you better choose carefully or you might regret it in the future." Whiteboards were handed out and Izuku stared at them until Shinso bopped him on the head and showed him how to use them. He thought up a hero's name and immediately found something he liked. "Who wants to go first?" Nem asked and Izuku bolted up to show off. Aoyama's ever-present smile cracked a bit and he sat down. Izuku showed everyone his name in terrible handwriting. "I still can't write very well but it says Hunter." He beamed. "It fits you very well." "Approved," Nem said with a ruffle of his messy hair. Izuku beamed and looked over his class. Mina was giving him thumbs up. And most everyone was nodding along with Nem's words. Except for Iida, Izuku could smell the anger and sadness coming off of him. Izuku hummed to himself and made a plan to talk to him. After all, he is the class leader and had to make sure everyone was safe and healthy. Like a pack, Izuku beamed at the idea of leading his pack. One by one, the others went up to give their hero codename. Meanwhile, Izuku looked up the heroes who sent him an invitation to work. He found a few interesting ones but no one that worked in the woods or near them. With a pout on his face, he began to look at heroes that looked interesting. The top one would have to be some guy named Gang Orca. He looks like a big orca like in the books he'd read, and he works next to the ocean. He'd always wanted to see the ocean. He slowly wrote his name in the area provided and nodded in satisfaction when it was legible. The class was let out for lunch and Izuku stood and caught Iida from rushing out. Uraraka was about to talk to him when he made some excuse, but Izuku didn't care much since he could tell Iida was lying. "Let's go talk, Iida." Izuku beamed. Iida tried to find a way to refuse but nodded with a sigh. "Great, come on, let's go to my room." Mina looked curiously on as Izuku abducted Iida. She hummed to herself and shrugged it off. "He'll be fine," she said to the others looking on. Izuku opened the door to his room and welcomed Iida inside. "What did you want to talk about, Izuku?" He didn't waste any time and asked. "Why do you smell sad and angry? It's not aimed at anyone here, so who?" Iida flinched a bit and narrowed his eyes at Izuku. "I don't think it's any of your business. You are part of my pack. I am the leader of the pack. I will make sure everyone in my pack is as healthy as they can be." Izuku said. The determination was evident. Iida mulled over his words and sighed as he had to admit his reasoning was right as a class president. "My brother was a hero named Ingenium. A villain named Stain paralyzed him from the waist down. His career was ended by that man and he stopped himself from continuing with his fists clenched." Izuku nodded along. "One of his family was injured critically by another person and he is angry at the man. He could smell more on Iida. You want to go kill him? The villain, I mean." Iida jerked up at the words. "What? I understand." Izuku nodded. A javelin of bone emerged and he broke it off. It was different than the usual ones. It was thinner and the tip was pinkish, like flesh. He held it out to Iida. "This will kill him for sure." Iida stared at the weapon in Izuku's hands and backed away. "What is that?" "You remember the Nomu at the USJ? It's something similar. I created parasites that burrowed into its body to block the nervous system and prevent it from moving. This is kinda the same. It's a parasite that will go into someone's body and instead of attacking the nervous system, it will eat and multiply for about 5 minutes and then destroy itself." He explained casually and waved the extremely dangerous weapon around. Iida stared at the object in Izuku's hands and then at him. Izuku misinterpreted the look and kept explaining. "It will be extremely painful. It was painful for the Nomu but he could heal. This will be like being eaten from the inside by bugs, I guess. But the best part is that there will be no evidence, except for you and what is left of Stain." Iida's pale face and sunken stomach gained him clarity of what he was contemplating. He shook his head. "I don't want to kill anyone. I just want Stain brought to justice," he said trembling. "Oh, well, aren't heroes already working on that?" Izuku tilted his head in confusion. "It's not fast enough but I can't use that on Stain. I shouldn't even be thinking of this." The corner of his eyes began to water and leaned back against the wall and slid down. Izuku watched awkwardly and sat in front of him. Todoroki had issues, I guess, and I think he went to talk to someone. Nem told me about therapists but I was happy with how I was. Maybe you should talk to people. Maybe your parents or something." He shrugged, not knowing what else to do. Iida cried for a bit longer and composed himself. "You're right, I've been bottling this up since I've found out. I need help." He looked across from him. "Thank you, Izuku. The pack leader takes care of his pack." Izuku beamed and got up with a handout for Iida. He took it and pulled him up. "So we don't need this then?" Izuku held up the bioweapon. "No, it's best to get rid of it." Iida stepped slightly away from it. Izuku nodded and tossed it out the window. Iida shouted in surprise and went after it to see it stuck in the ground. Izuku looked outside too and they witnessed the grass and ground eat themselves away and revealed squirming things underneath. They stared for 5 minutes and then it stopped with all the worm things dissolving. A crater the size of a head was left in its wake. Izuku hummed in thought. It would have worked better if it was used on a person. I made them work with organic materials on a person, not the grass and ground. It's good to know it works on it too. Izuku shrugged. Iida stared in horror at what he contemplated doing to a person. With a pale face, he backed away from the window and looked down at Izuku. The feral boy's stomach grumbled and he looked up and beamed. Let's go find some food, Izuku said and made to leave. Iida followed and thought about what they had talked about moments ago. Izuku sat carrying his large tray of food next to Mina. She snorted at the absurd amount on his tray and bumped her shoulder with him in greeting. Where did you go? Shinso asked. I had to make sure Iida was all right. He is now. The others looked at each other in confusion, and Mina asked. What do you mean? Iida's brother was hurt badly and he was sad and angry. So I talked to him and now he should be better, I guess. He shrugged. Oh, that's thoughtful of you. Juro smiled. Thanks. I'm the pack leader and need to make sure everyone is safe and happy. Shinso shook his head. I mean, it's pretty close to your responsibilities as class president. He sighed in acceptance. Did you guys find out where you were going for the interview thing? I'm going with Gang Orca. Izuku asked. Why him? Isn't he more aquatic than Woods? Mina took a bite from Izuku's lunch. I wanted to see the ocean, and he looked cool. Plus, I don't think there were any heroes on my papers that work in the woods. He grumbled. I'm going with Eraserhead. He's pretty much my alley in terms of hero work. Shinso shrugged. I'm thinking of going with Present Mike, Juro said. Mina and Shoji were undecided. They ate their lunch, and Izuku caught the looks Monoma was giving him from across the lunchroom. He waved with a smile, and the blonde waved him over. Lunch ended, but Izuku walked over anyway. He followed him into his class, and Vlad King raised an eyebrow as he walked in. Hey, Noma, Izuku greeted with his usual smile. I was going to ask about what you were talking about during the festival, but it seems inappropriate at the moment. He gestured to the filling classroom. He did smile at the nickname Izuku gave him. Izuku tilted his head in thought. Oh, that, I don't mind, but I'll wait until everyone arrives so I don't have to repeat myself. He saw Vlad furrow his brow but didn't stop him. Are you sure? I don't want to cry. Monoma tried to backpedal. It's fine. He waved him off and turned to the rest of the class looking at him. Hello, I'm Izuku, the pack leader of 1A. Class president. Vlad corrected. That. Izuku nodded and pointed at the tall man. What's going on? Tetsu raised his hand. Monoma wanted to know what he overheard during the festival, and I thought it would be a good idea to let you all know like I did in my class. I'll give you the short version. You don't have to. Monoma tried again. When I was 5ish, Mother took me to the middle of the woods and left me there to die. I survived, got my quirk, and then came to UA. He said and looked around at the blank stares aimed at him. That isn't funny, man. What kind of sick joke is this? Oh, this is like a prank. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. I'm not joking. Oh yay, prove it, someone challenged. Izuku thought about it for a moment and looked out the window to the woods. All right, I'll be right back. He dove out the window, and his changed form was seen sprinting to the woods. Vlad, what's going on? Kendo asked her homeroom teacher. Izuku is telling you his story. He shrugged. Seriously, it's kinda sick that he would joke about something like that. Tetsu shook his head in disgust. He's coming back, and he's got something, Kodai said, looking out the window. Izuku scrambled up and presented them with the wolf's skull and the obsidian blade he used. Here, this was the wolf that tried to eat me, and this is what I used to kill it. He beamed. The whole class was quiet as they looked between the skull with the cracked eye socket, the ratty-wrapped obsidian blade, and Izuku. The feral child felt a hand ruffle his hair, and he looked up to see it was Vlad. I'll explain in better detail. Go on before Eraserhead throws a fit. He grinned down. Alright, see you guys later. He left and popped back inside. And I don't mean any harm to any of you. That's for the animal quirk people, bye. And he was gone. It was quiet for all 5 seconds, and then Vlad was bombarded by questions. Vlad raised his hand, and everyone quieted. Izuku came to the UA entrance exam with a friend to try it out. Nezu noticed the lackluster information on his application and called for him, and everything he said was true. He was abandoned in God knows where and survived on his own by hunting and luck. His mother was arrested and sentenced, and since the exam, Izuku has been a ward of UA. He lives on campus but likes to sleep in the woods instead of in his room. I'm sharing all this because he doesn't seem to care who knows. That's why he is a bit feral at times. He sighed at having to say the word. He looked around to see a few misty eyes. Izuku walked into his class with his trophy and what killed it. Aizawa turned a glare at him. And where have you been? Telling 1B about before UA. He shrugged. Whatcha got there, bud? Kirishima asked. The wolf that tried to eat me. He presented it for all to see with a smile. What the fuck, Izuku? Shinso groaned. Why do you have that with you? Izuku shrugged. 1B didn't believe me. They wanted proof, so here it is. Sit down before I give to detention, Aizawa growled and glared at Izuku. The rest of the class was set as a study hall for them to work on who they would want to intern under and their hero names if they didn't choose one already. Izuku sat with the wolf skull held by a tendril on his back. He filled the rest of his form out and practiced his handwriting skills. The rest of the week passed without much excitement. Izuku and Mina hung out after school on occasion, but they didn't go on another outing like before. His other friends joined him, and Izuku welcomed them with open arms. He caught 1B giving him glances every once in a while, but Izuku paid them no mind. Class 1A met up at the train station to depart for their week at their internships. Izuku rode with Aizawa after a tight hug from Nem. From what Izuku gleaned, Iida chose to go with a close partner agency to his family's agency. He was glad Iida wasn't doing something stupid like hunting down a serial killer. Izuku could do it, but he had no reason to. Everyone has their hero suits. If you don't, figure it out. Remember to be respectful and don't cause trouble. He looked directly at Izuku. Izuku stepped to the side, and his eyes followed him. Oh, do you mean me? There were scattered giggles from the class. I swear, you will drive me crazy. Aizawa groaned with his eyes covered by his hand. Crazy. I was crazy once. No. Kaminari, stop teaching him dumb shit. Izuku was cut off by Jiro jabbing her earlobes at the laughing blonde. Get out of my sight already. Aizawa pointed into the distance. Everyone split up after some farewells. Mina gave Izuku an embrace and a peck on the cheek. Take care, Zuku. And she ran off to catch her train. Shinso patted his shoulder and walked off. Don't get lost, if you do. Don't. Shoji and Jiro both waved and headed to their trains. Izuku read the train ticket he was supposed to follow and board the train. He was nervous. This would be the first time he would be going far on his own. Before, he went just a few blocks from Ua and his den, but now he was going to another city. While he was sure he would be fine, he still felt anxious. A bit later, he was able to see the ocean. His face became glued to the glass as he took in the view. The loudspeaker announced the stop and Izuku jolted to get off. He grabbed all his stuff and got off the train nervously. He looked around his new environment and took his phone out to follow the map route. He looked around at the new building and tentatively began to follow the indicator on his phone. Izuku stopped and looked up from his phone to see a large building with a glass front and some people moving in and out. He put his phone away and walked in. He looked around at the inside and all the people moving around. The interior had a few ocean-themed pieces around like a painting or part of a boat. Someone cleared their throats, but Izuku ignored it. They did it again, but louder. Nothing. Excuse me. Izuku turned to the person and saw a woman behind a desk staring at him. Can I help you? He looked confused when the lady looked even more annoyed. Funny guy, huh? What's your business here? The lady asked rudely. I'm Izuku. I'm here to intern under Gang Orca. The map said to come here. He introduced himself. Oh, it's you. Hold on a moment. Her tone changed immediately and she dialed her phone. After a quick conversation, she hung up and turned to him. He'll be here in a moment. Izuku nodded and kept looking around until he heard a thump and the smell of ocean water behind him. Izuku casually turned around and looked up to stare at two narrowed eyes and a tense posture. Hello. Izuku gave his biggest smile. Could you please retract your presence? The hero ground out. Presences. Oh, that thing. Izuku cleared his throat. I mean you no harm. He shouted out and then looked around proud of the thought of doing it all at once instead of one at a time. It got quiet in the open room and slowly everyone went back to work. That's one way of doing it. How is your presence so strong? How do you not know how to control it? Gang Orca asked. I don't know. He shrugged. Shinso said it was because I was around wolves too much. And no one has told me I could control it. I just thought people with animal quirks would always be scared of me. Gang Orca stared at him curiously. Let's get you settled first and then we can talk. Follow me. They walked into the elevator and they rode it up 2 floors to a row of doors in a common room. Gang Orca walked Izuku to one open room and motioned him in. This will be your room for your stay here. He saw the pursed lips and asked, is there a problem? Not really, I'm not used to sleeping in a bed. We have tatami if you prefer. He pointed to a closet door. Tatami, I don't know what that is. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Gang Orca paused and furrowed his brows. Then how do you usually sleep? In my den, on my furs. I made these planks to put under my furs and it made it more firm. He smiled up in the pride of his invention. The hero continued to stare at the short boy and burst out laughing. Izuku didn't know why he was laughing but he smiled anyway at the sound. That is quite funny. He patted Izuku's shoulder. I don't understand, what was funny? He tilted his head. Your joke. Now Gang Orca was confused. Wait, you're serious? You sleep in a den? Like in the wilderness? Yep. Did Nezu not tell you? Nem said he would explain. Your file only had a personal note from Nezu saying, have fun, that's it. What's going on? Izuku furrowed his brow. Why would he do that? He shrugged and continued to tell Gang Orca his life story for the nth time in the past months. The hero only stared at him in horror at what he had been through. And then, I asked Mina to be my mate and now we're mates. Izuku finished with a beaming smile. The hero stumbled back and held his head as he processed everything he was just told. I am so sorry you went through all of that. No child should ever have to fight to survive the way you did. He said in a somber tone. Izuku shrugged. I'm okay, it was hard at first. He recalled shivering in the cave when the first winter came. He shook his head and smiled. But I have friends and I'm really good at hunting now. Gang Orca admired the boy's will and gave a smile of his own. That you do. He patted his head. Go on and toss your things in there and I'll give you a tour of the place. Izuku beamed and did exactly that. He threw his stuff into the room and closed it behind him. Gang Orca chucked and began walking around the building to show him everything he would need to know. He showed Izuku the gym, the showers, the cafeteria, and Gang Orca's favorite place, the pool. The building sat on the edge of the ocean and underneath was a pool that connected to the saltwater. Whoa, are we going to go swimming? Izuku asked excitedly. The hero laughed at his enthusiasm. Most likely, you know how to swim. I do. It's harder now with my bones being almost metal and everything else, but I think I can make some fins to make it easier. He nodded. Metal bone. I thought your quirk allowed you to copy animal parts at your will. That's what it seemed when I watched you at the festival. I can control my body down to the cells. I just copy a lot of things from animals since it was easy to copy them. Izuku showed his wolf's leg as an example and then shifted his hands into paws. But I can do whatever I want, so I reinforced my bones with carbon and iron and overall improved my body. The cat's paws turned into vicious claws that extended a couple of feet and then into a javelin. He pulled the javelin out of his arms and twirled it. That's incredible. Gang Orca leaned down to watch Izuku shift his body. That makes much more sense. But what about your presence? Is that your doing? I don't know what that is. Anyone with an animal quirk reacts the same way. I don't do it on purpose. He shrugged apologetically. That is something we can work on then. Was there anything else you wanted to work on while you were here? I just wanted to see the ocean, it's nice. Izuku smiled out to the view. Gang Orca chuckled and nodded. It is nice, isn't it? Alright, let's try to work on your presence. Alright, how? Izuku stared up at the tall hero. From what I've learned from others and my father is that it works with intent. When I first felt your presence it was like a beast came into my territory to see what there was to see. Not aggressive but overbearing nonetheless. That's why when you claimed that you would harm anyone, it receded. He lectured. He looked to Izuku and he was seated and listening intently. He chuckled and sat in front of him. So the reason I scare people is that they sense a strong predator nearby. How do I stop that then? I don't do anything and people are scared. What do you feel at the moment you walked into the building? Izuku thought back and answered truthfully. Nervous at being in a new location and excited to be here. The hero pointed at Izuku. Exactly. They will always sense a predator when you are near. But you can lessen it by controlling yourself. Izuku furrowed his brow in confusion. I don't understand. I get that they will sense me but not the last part. Control myself how? The orca man hummed in thought to explain it better. Let's work backward then. I want you to focus your intent and presence on me and keep it that way. One step at a time, I will walk you through how to reel that in. Izuku tilted his head and worry creased his face. Are you sure that's a good idea? You said just my normal presence is scary. Don't worry, pup, I'm stronger than I look. Gang Orca chuckled good-naturedly. Not a pup, Izuku pouted. Alright, here I go. He stared at Gang Orca as if he were his prey. That's not right. What? You're not trying hard enough. This was less than what I felt at the entrance. Focus your intent and direct it at me. Izuku hummed in thought. What if I say it out loud? Like I did earlier. Worth a shot, but I'd like you to be able to control it without saying a word. Got it. Izuku stared at the hero again and focused. You will be add to my trophies. Gang Orca heard the boy speak and the words reverberated in his head. He felt primal terror at his words. All he knew was that he was in danger and he needed to run. He can't fight, he'll lose. Run, run, run. Izuku was paralyzed by a hypersonic wave of sound straight to his face. The next thing he saw was Gang Orca leap into the ocean and begin to swim away at blinding speed. Izuku slumped over and he was able to call out before Gang Orca left his hearing range. Gang, I didn't mean it. Izuku witnesses Gang Orca slow and realization hit him and he hurriedly swam back and leapt up to where Izuku was frozen on the ground. I am so sorry. Are you hurt, Izuku? Gang Orca helped Izuku sit up. I can heal. I guess that was too much. Izuku said sheepishly. The man let out a breath and sat next to Izuku soaking wet. Yes, not even when I was a pup had I experienced something like this. He went quiet in thought and then asked. What did you mean by trophies? He turned to Izuku. He slowly began to move his arms as the effects of the quirk wore off. I collect trophies from my hunts. Not all of them, only the special ones. I have the wolf's skull that tried to eat me. There's a badger skull from when I first shared a meal with Shinso. Stuff like that. That makes sense when you said those words out loud. It felt like should get as far away from you as possible. My instincts told me that I would lose in a conflict with you. I am a really good hunter. Izuku nodded in agreement. Gang Orca gave him an incredulous look. Even in the ocean. Izuku paused at that. I'd figure a way, I'm also very patient. He said smugly. The hero bellowed out a laugh and ruffled his hair roughly. Makes sense why you chose the name Hunter. Izuku began to tip over from his rough affection and Gang went to grab him but a tendril pushed him back. That should wear off pretty soon. I'd figure. Izuku nodded. Hey, Gang, I'm getting hungry. Am I allowed to go hunt in the ocean? I haven't had fish in a while. Izuku stared greedily at a small school of fish. Maybe another time. Let's go to the cafeteria and I'll tell you about a schedule one have cooked up. I'll modify it as needed but I'm sure we'll have a grand time. Gang gave him a toothy smile. Izuku showed his teeth in a smile and nodded. When Izuku could move again, he followed Gang to the cafeteria for a meal. Gang ordered a large platter of mostly raw fish and the feral boy's mouth watered. When he ordered he got the same as Gang to the amusement of everyone. Izuku sat next to Gang and devoured the food just as fast as his mentor for the week. Gang grinned at the boy and was excited for the week to come. Izuku and Gang finished their meals and moved the trays to the side. Gang Orca began to explain what a hero's duty is. After patrolling the streets, they would go back to the agency and fill out any paperwork for incidents that occurred during the patrol. Izuku soaked it all in and nodded along. That makes sense. What then? Izuku asked. Then you usually get off of work and go home. But sometimes it's needed for the hero to stay at the agency for special occasions or go somewhere else. For example, you might get called to show up at a school to talk to children. Talk to them. For what? Izuku tilted his head. Right, You didn't go to school to give out lectures about doing the right things, like avoiding drugs and doing good in school for a good job later in life. Oh, I get it. It's like advice from someone special. Izuku had a daydream of someone coming to the woods to tell him not to take fox cubs for himself because the cubs get sad and the parents get very angry. You all right there, Izuku? Gang asked softly. Izuku shook himself awake. Yep, just thinking of fox cubs. Izuku beamed. Gang chuffed and shook his head. That sounds adorable, and began to stand. They are, but they get sad when I take them from their parents, Izuku said sadly towards the end. Right then, let's continue your training with your presence. I want you to be able to control it without having to say anything. It would be bad to scare everyone that we are trying to make feel safe. Izuku nodded. All right, he said excitedly. For the next 3 hours, Izuku practiced his presence on Gang Orca. He quickly began to learn how to keep it reined in. Gang Orca had a few of his sidekicks with animal quirks come in and test it on them. Gang Orca gestured for them to look at Izuku. What do you sense? Gang Orca asked. The 4 with different animal quirks turned to a smiling Izuku. I sense that he is adorable. The woman with gills cooed and pinches his cheeks. Izuku smiled more bashfully. I already have a mate. A man with bluish skin and scaled skin barked out a laugh. Don't worry kid, she's not a homewrecker. She's my mate. He turned to his boss and shrugged as if to say he had nothing. The other 2 also shook their heads. I sense nothing, like any other non-animal quirk person. One of them said and the other nodded. Gang Orca clapped his hands once and smiled. Wonderful. Great job, Izuku. The feral boy beamed at the praise. Can we go out and patrol, now? Gang Orca looked outside and saw it was late into the night. Tomorrow morning, he said. Izuku pouted. But I can see in the dark and don't need sleep every night. Gang Orca chuckled and ruffled his messy hair. But I do and I can't see in the dark. In the morning we'll go out. Everyone went their separate ways and Izuku went to his room after a hot shower. While he could manage without cleaning for days, he liked to stay clean. Izuku walked into his room and stared at where he should sleep. He went to the bed to try it out and it was nice to sit on, but he was used to the firm furs of his den. He remembered that the hero said there was something in the closet and he went to check. He unfolded the mat and Izuku tested it. He grudgingly accepted it and lay down to sleep. When the sun began to shine over the horizon, Izuku woke up. He stretched and cracked most of the bones in his body in satisfaction. His muscles underneath his skin rippled and flexed to stretch them as well. With a sigh of relief, he looks around and was unsure what to do now. He sat and then took his phone to see if anyone messaged him. He had a few waiting, a few from Nem asking if he made it all right, and a couple from his friends. He responded to Nem and she immediately messaged him back, happy to hear he didn't get lost. Shinso was complaining about Eraserhead's training. He messaged back a laughing emoji. Mina was asking how his internship was going so far. He sent her a message and then a moment later she was calling. Zuku. Mina groaned, still half asleep. Hi, Mina, you still asleep? Izuku asked cheerily, happy to be talking with his mate. Mina hummed happily to hear his jovial voice. My alarm woke me a few minutes ago but I didn't want to get up. How is Gang Orca? He's super tall. He's teaching me to control my presence so we can go out to patrol today. Presences. What's that? Izuku hears Mina move around on the other side of the line. It's what made Sue and Tokiyami scared of me. Gang said it was usually for people with animal quirks but I have it. He said with a shrug. Oh, that's neat. Can you use it to scare people now without scaring others? I think so. He said it was really strong for someone like me. Even he was scared off by it. That's so cool. Mina gushed. What about you? What is your hero teaching you? They're pretty alright. Just learning how to use my acid in different ways. Maybe I can even use it to climb like you do. That would be great. I can teach you how to jump trees like I do. There was a knock on Izuku's door and he stared at it without knowing what to do. Yes, he asked tentatively. He could smell it was Gang Orca on the other side but this was the first time answering a door. He heard Mina giggle on the phone. Gang Orca opened the door in his suit and found Izuku sitting in the middle of the room with his phone. I apologize to interrupt. Are you ready for your patrol? Yes. I gotta go, Mina. Alright. Talk to you later. Izuku heard her kiss the phone and hang up. Gang Orca smirked. Was that your mate? It was. Izuku beamed and began to change clothes without an ounce of shame in front of Gang Orca. He averted his eyes. She's nice. Her name is Mina. She's the one with pink everything with black eyes and horns. Izuku paused as he was putting his hero suit on. I can grow horns, should I? The hero smiled softly at the innocent romance. You can change your body at will, I don't see the harm in it. If you don't like it, change it back. He shrugged. Izuku nodded and finished changing. But what kind? He hummed in thought. He looked around the room and found a mirror. He stood in front of it and Gang Orca's form loomed to his side watching curiously. Izuku recalled the horns he'd seen in books and on people. He didn't want them to be too big like that one girl in 1B but smaller like Mina's. He liked her horns. He didn't think they served any purpose but he liked them on her. He thought of ram's horns but they were too big, although he did like the ridges on them. He shrugged and made one he liked. At his hairline, flesh tore away, and 2 horns grew out slowly. They grew forward for a few centimeters and then began to grow to the back of his head at a right angle. Then they lazily curled up at the tips. They had the same ridges that a ram did and they grew over just parallel to his eyes. They weren't too big but at least 3 times thicker than Mina's. Izuku shifted his head from side to see every angle and nodded in satisfaction. He began to feel at them and giggled at the new addition. I like them. The hero was mildly disturbed by the display and sound of tearing flesh and shifting bone but he had to admit they did look good on the young man. They won't get in the way. He leaned down to examine them. I doubt it. I made them this way so they didn't affect my movement. He shook his head and got used to the little bit of extra weight. Very well. Let's go to the gym. I want to see where you stand against a pro hero. Gang Orca grinned. Izuku hopped on his paws and clenched his hands. We get to fight? He asked excitedly. The hero laughed and led him to an open gym with nothing in the space. Gang Orca went to one side and Izuku stayed on his side. Alright, no quirks. I want to see your combat abilities to see how would you do in the field. I don't want to throw you against someone that's way over your head and get hurt. Izuku nodded. I guess that makes sense. At the festival Nem said there were rules. Are there rules here? Ah, yes. Let's do the first to 3 solid hits wins. No quirks, anything else goes. Ready? Izuku grinned in a more feral way that made Gang Orca hesitate. Go. Instead of waiting to see how Gang Orca fought, Izuku dashed forward. His grin never left his face and he was upon the hero in mere moments. Izuku was fast and down low, the opposite of Gang Orca's slower and big build. The feral boy went to slam his fist to the hero's knee to bring him down but Gang Orca saw it coming and raised his leg and took the hit on his shin. He winced at the punch and kicked out with the same leg. Izuku was already moving past the leg and it missed him by a mile. Izuku jabbed at his core and landed a solid hit on his side. Gang Orca keened in pain and threw his massive hand against where Izuku was. He took the hit and stopped it with his strength. Gang Orca met eyes with the boy and the boy smiled even wider as Izuku bit his free hand deeply and threw the blood at the hero's eyes. He was shocked at the tactic and blinded at the same time. He stumbled back and Izuku took the initiative to slam his fist into Gang Orca's knee, causing him to fall in pain. Izuku pounced onto his back as he fell and instinctively went for the side of the neck where the carotid arteries were but stopped himself and tapped the hero's top of his head. I win. Izuku cheered. Gang Orca groaned. How is it that you are so strong? Does your quirk grant you to enhance your strength and speed? Izuku got off of his back and swiped his hand over the blood on Gang Orca's face and it was picked up like a wet wipe. I changed stuff in my body to be better. Metal bones, compact muscles, added nerves, and more. Gang Orca sat up and watched as the deep bit on Izuku's hand stitched close. That would explain it. You fight dirty, he said, half accused and half impressed. Dirty? My blood isn't dirty, it's as clean as I don't know what's something super clean. Izuku tried to scratch his head but bumped into the horn and he smiled and felt at it. Fighting dirty is a way to say that you don't hold anything back and do your utmost to win. That includes throwing something into your opponent's eyes, kicking them in the jewels, or biting. He explained. Jewels. Your manly bits. Gang Orca pointed down. Oh, yay. Getting hit there hurts a lot. But why is it dirty? Izuku winced at a memory in the woods. Gang Orca chuckled and stood up. When fighting, it's expected to be honorable and as fair as it can be. Villains will sometimes use such a tactic and it's usually frowned upon. But if you are fighting for your life, then do whatever you can to live. He finished seriously. That sorta makes sense, I guess. But you don't have to worry about me. I know when not to hold back. Izuku waved the serious atmosphere away. That's good to hear. I say it's about time we go out on patrol. How's your presence? Gang Orca moved to the exit. It's good, I think. I mean I can't feel it, so. Izuku shrugged. Well, I can't feel a thing from you. Released a bit like you were warning someone. Izuku focused on his intent to warn off something and Gang Orca nodded in approval. How's that? Very good, you're a fast learner. Gang Orca tried to ruffle Izuku's hair but the horns got in the way. Izuku frowned at the disadvantage of having horns that covered his head. He felt his forehead and decided to move them. They grew straight out of his forehead for a couple of centimeters and then they went upwards for a bit longer and tapered off at a point. Instead of growing above his eyes, they were closer to the temples of his head. He absorbed the first pair of horns and felt at the open space of his hair. He likes to have his hair ruffled by people. He turned to Gang Orca and he raises an eyebrow at Izuku. The feral boy pouted and took the large hand of the hero and set it on his head. The hero laughed heartily and rubbed his head until Izuku ducked his head at the force. Izuku laughed as well and they went off to begin their patrol in the early morning. Gang Orca and Izuku walked out into the streets and Izuku followed excitedly next to the hero. He went on to explain the reasons heroes patrol where people could see them. It's both to stop crime and to provide people comfort that a hero is nearby in case they need help. That makes sense. So we can be friendly and stuff, or do we have to be serious? Izuku asked and looked around for crime. It depends on the hero. But it's usually better to be friendly than serious all the time. Gang Orca explained. Izuku nodded and they kept walking around with civilians recognizing both Gang Orca and Izuku from the sports festival. When people waved, Izuku waved back cheerily. He quickly became someone to brighten another's day with his consistent smile. Gang Orca smiled in approval at the boy as they walked further and further into the city. They stopped when a little boy ran from his mother and up to Izuku. You're Kayama, you won the first year sports festival. The boy with canine attributes almost shouted. I like you the most because you have wolf legs like me. But yours are weird. He showed off his gray-haired legs which were very similar to Izuku's. You have horns. They are weird. Izuku nodded and crouched to his level. I didn't grow the hair since they could get in the way of my quirks. I didn't. He shrugged. I grew these today. They're cool, right? Izuku showed off his horns. The kid nodded and his ears on top of his head flopped at the movement. They are. You can grow things. That's cool. The boy gushed. Izuku beamed and the boy did the same and showed off his juvenile fangs. The boy's mother walked up to the two finally and she had much of the same attributes that her son did. Mom. It's Izuku Kayama. The boy pulled his smiling mother to Izuku. What's your hero's name? The boy asked curiously. Oh, it's Hunter. He said. Hunter. That's an odd name. The mother said. I like to hunt and it fits. Izuku shrugged. What's the biggest thing you've hunted? I've gotten a squirrel last year. The boy asked. A deer, but I really want to hunt a bear. I just need to find one. Lucky. One day I'll get a deer. Like you and Dad. He said determined. Izuku nodded and accepted his vow. How come I can't sense you? The boy turned back to questions. Sense. Oh, you mean this. Izuku released his presence but it came out differently than usual. Gang Orca went to stop him but he stopped himself and felt at ease. Wow, it's like Dad's but bigger and everywhere. The boy said completely relaxed. Izuku looked confused and turned to his mentor. It feels like the pack leader is watching over us, it's reassuring. The hero smiled softly. Izuku realized that he could use his presence in the opposite direction of scaring people and making them feel safe. His instinct came when he was talking to the young boy, and his intent to protect him from any harm expanded into his presence. Now, his presence was released and expanded to his immediate area. "I think it's time we get going and let the boys get back to work," the mother said, nudging her son. The boy nodded and waved at Izuku and Gang Orca as he left. The hero patted Izuku's head and they got moving again, with Izuku's presence wide open with the intent to protect others from harm. Sometimes, a person with an animal quirk passed near enough to feel the presence and they gratefully nodded in his direction. "Gang, why don't you or everyone else do this? Because your presence is abnormally strong. I am trying to do the same as you are, but it only extends a couple of feet at best," he explained. Izuku got inside Gang Orca's bubble and sensed something faintly. "That's what it feels like. Good to know." They continued for the rest of the day until it was close to sunset. They headed back to the agency for Izuku to learn how to fill out paperwork. He sat down and Gang Orca explained what to fill out for the day. It was simple since there was nothing to report. Izuku nodded along but stares at the pen and then up to the hero. "What is it?" Gang Orca asked. "I still can't write very good," Izuku admitted sheepishly, "but I'm a really fast typer." He tried to make up for his shortcoming. Gang Orca looked confused for a moment and then nodded in realization. "It's been less than a couple of months since you had to learn how to write. Don't worry about writing then. I'll pull up the same paper on the computer for you to type." He smiled, reasoning to Izuku. The feral boy smiled in return and his report was done in a flash with his typing skills. With that, they headed to bed after a large meal from the cafeteria. The next morning, Izuku and his mentor were headed out on patrol after a couple of spars that ended with Gang Orca laid out multiple times. When they finished, Gang Orca led the way down the streets. Izuku looked around curiously at the different paths they were taking. They passed an alleyway and Izuku stopped and sniffed the air. "Hey, gang, I smell blood down that alley." Izuku pointed with his arm stretched out. Gang Orca looked back and furrowed his brows. He stepped forward in front of Izuku. "Can you tell how old or if it was humans?" he asked. Izuku sniffed again. "Human. It's pretty fresh, I think." Gang Orca nodded and led down the alleyway quietly. He looked back to make sure his disciple was following and he was, but no noise came from his passing. Gang Orca shivered at the effectiveness of the boy and turned back. They heard a scuffle and some lowered voices. They sped up and came upon a man in a business suit curled up on his side while two men robbed him. The hero rushed forward and took them by surprise. One heard the noise of the heavy footfalls and turned just in time to see the big hero take down his associate. The second thug didn't give it a second thought and ran away, leaving the first thug. Something grabbed his leg and he tripped. He looked back to see a long bony whip wrapped around his leg and dragging him back to Izuku. The second thug pulled out a knife and jammed it into the whip. It cut into the exposed flesh between the bones and Izuku let go for a moment as the whip split into four and shot at the quivering man. The four tendrils grabbed each appendage and held him spread eagle on the ground. "Good job, Hunter. Are you hurt?" Gang Orca went over to the second thug and cuffed him after he did the same to the first. The victim was sitting up and looked relieved. "He stabbed me, but I'm all right." Izuku retracted his tendrils from the shivering man. Izuku turned to the civilian and hesitated. "Hello, civilian, we are here to help," he said, very unsure where to go on from there. Gang Orca chucked. "Relax, just talk like you always do. No need to act any different if you don't like it." "Oh, all right. Also, should we get the guy hiding behind that big trash can?" Izuku pointed at the dumpster on the other end of the alley they came in. "Shit." The third thug that was supposed to be the lookout bolted. "Mine," Izuku said in the glee of getting an opportunity to go hunting. He didn't think his full hunter form was necessary, so he just switched to his faster legs and clawed hands. The third thug looked over his shoulder to see the hunter on all fours sprinting at him. His face had a large smile and his hair was blowing back from the speed. The thug cursed in fear and activated his quirk to get away. The hunter witnessed the man turn into a cloud of black smoke and rush up the building to the roof just as he was about to grab him. That didn't stop him as he leapt from one wall to the other and scrambled up the edge to find his prey, leaping across to the other building to get away. Izuku grinned and sprinted after the prey. He saw the thug jump down another alleyway. He tracked the scent to the thug running into the road and almost get run over. He looked behind himself to see the hunter sprinting on his trail again. He turned into a cloud of smoke and weaved through the rest of the traffic in a flash. He turned back to see if that was enough, but only paled when the beast was jumping over cars without an issue. The third thug stumbled back and tried to run, only to trip over his feet. He heard a thump and the scraping of claws on concrete directly behind him. He turned around and didn't see anyone but felt the clawed hands grip his arm and neck. He slumped in defeat. "I give up." "Great. Let's go back to gang," the boy behind him said cheerily. The crowd around them snapped pictures and took videos of Izuku escorting the thug down the street and across the crosswalk to where they came from. He stopped and looked around. He hummed in thought. "That way, I think." Izuku sniffed the air and it was difficult to tell with the smell of the city everywhere. Or was it that way? "Kid, are you seriously lost?" the third thug asked in disbelief and amusement. "Don't tell me, I can figure it out." He looked around and hesitantly chose one direction. After a few steps, he stopped. "Okay, I'm lost. What to do, he said to himself. His phone rang and he brightened. He looked at who was calling and answered. "Gang, I caught him, but I'm lost." "That's good to hear. Stay where you are, I'll track your phone." Gang Orca hung up. Izuku nodded and sat crisscrossed on the sidewalk with the thug's hands tied together with a tendril. The thug looked at the boy who scared the shit out of him not moments ago. The thug shook his head and knelt next to the kid in resignation. "Why aren't you trying to run away again?" Izuku asked the thug and he swayed back and forward like a child. The thug looked at Izuku and raised an eyebrow. "What's it matter? You'll catch me again and I can't use my quirk again for the day." "That makes sense." He nodded and watched the people give him odd looks. "What's your name anyways?" the thug asked. "I'm Hunter." Izuku beamed and introduced himself. "Hunter. That's a weird name, how'd you choose that?" "Because I'm a great hunter," he said simply. Gang Orca rounded the bend with two police officers on his heels. He saw Izuku sitting on the sidewalk with the thug next to him. The thug let out a defeated sigh and complied with getting handcuffed. He looked back to Izuku. "Later kid, thanks for not beating the shit out of me." "Of course, I wouldn't. You were already caught and don't say bad words." He heard the thug bark out a laugh and the policeman chuckled. Gang Orca looked Izuku up and down. He nodded and then ruffled his hair roughly. "Great job on your first incident." Izuku beamed under the praise. "But it wasn't my first, I was at the USJ. Do you know about that?" "Ah, that's right. I am still counting this as your first crime fight. Let us continue with the route." He motioned back where they came from and Izuku followed. For the rest of the day, it was just as calm as it was the previous day. When the two arrived back at the agency, they got to work on the reports. Izuku finished and stood to leave Gang Orca to continue working on whatever he had on his desk. Izuku wandered around and found himself at the saltwater pool connected to the ocean. He spotted some fish swimming lazily around and his eyes focused on his new objective. He casually looked around and then dove into the water to catch the fish that mocked him by looking tantalizing. He sunk to the bottom of the pool and grasped the fish in both his hands with a victorious smile. He devoured them under the water with glee and finally noticed his eyes stung and he couldn't breathe. His lung capacity was larger than what his size should have been, but it was limited. He experimentally made fins on his legs and his fingers became webbed for better swimming. Next, he added translucent eyelids for ease of seeing. He looked around and nodded in satisfaction but still couldn't breathe. He glared at the fish mocking him by swimming around him. He snatched one with a tendril and swam up with some difficulty. He breached the surface of the water and sat on the pool's edge with the live fish at hand. He made his finger a needle and speared its brain to end its suffering. It went limp with some postmortem spasms and Izuku began to dissect the gills to see how he could copy them. With careful precision, his tendrils sliced the fresh fish open and began to see how it worked. He had a basic idea of how fish gills worked, but this would be best if he wanted to copy the gills onto himself. Gang Orca finished his work and looked out the window to see Izuku sitting at the pool's edge with something in his hands. He was engrossed in whatever he held, so the hero went to check on him. He found his intern meticulously tearing a fish apart. He was slightly horrified when he thought Izuku was torturing the animal but calmed down when he noticed his neck trying to copy the gills he was observing. Finally, Izuku beamed and his gills flapped open and closed. And then he tossed the fish he was cutting open into his mouth. Gang Orca chucked and Izuku turned to him with his mouth full. "I see you went out on a swim." Izuku nodded and swallowed the mostly whole fish down. "I couldn't breathe, so gills." He flapped his gills open and closed. "How well do they work?" the hero asked and sat next to Izuku. "Probably good, let's see." Izuku leaned forward and sunk into the deep of the pool. He tentatively used his gills to breathe in the water. He did it again to get used to breathing underwater and then beamed in success. Izuku swam back up to the edge of the pool. "They work. Now, to hunt. Do be careful," Gang Orca said to Izuku as he dove back into the water. Izuku's feral smile was plastered on his face as he torpedoed into the ocean to find an appropriate animal to hunt. He saw many fish of different variations and was tempted to hunt a good one, but they didn't have trophies like land animals did. The bones of a fish were usually softer and bland looking. He kept looking and then found what he wanted. A shark swam around in the distance where Izuku could see it. He beamed in anticipation but held himself in check. He could swim well enough but he wasn't fast enough to catch the shark. He could grow a tail but that was the easy way out. He couldn't trap it so he will just have to bait it. And what better bait than his blood? Izuku's hands grew sharp claws and he slashed his forearm. Blood leaked out of his arm at a rapid rate and then he closed it. The effect was immediate as the shark in the distance pivoted in his direction and darted forward. Izuku smiled and waited for it to reach him. When it got close, he could see it was about twice as long as Izuku was tall. The shark circled him a few times and then darted in for a bite at Izuku in the middle of the cloud of blood. He took the charge head on and held the mouth open with his clawed hands. He struggled to keep the jaws open but failed against the strength of the shark. The jaws slammed shut on one of his arms and he was dragged along for the ride. He cried in pain when the teeth dug into his bones and the shark whipped its head side to side to take it off. Through the pain, Izuku used his other hand to tear at the flesh of the shark. Tendrils extended and stabbed into the shark while his paws gouged at its gills and side. Izuku even went as far as to bite the shark back with his teeth. The shark thrashed in pain of its own and went up to breach the surface. For one glorious moment, Izuku was visible in the jaws of a shark twice his size as he tore the shark apart in a battle of predators. Izuku crashed into the water as the shark let go of his arm in favor of trying to run away. He didn't let it get away and clung to its back and tore into the tough hide of the animal. Finally, it went stiff as Izuku speared his hand between its eyes and then it went limp. Izuku let go and yelled in triumph under the water. He took a hold of the large predator and began to take bites out of his prey. It was a very unique flavor and he enjoyed it until scavengers began to show and take nibbles at his meal. His presence washed out in aggression and all the small fish scattered away in fear. He smiled at his successful new skill but focused back on his meal. He sliced its belly open and gutted the fish, only leaving the heart and liver alone. His only thought was to drag it back to the pool and cook it up in the kitchen. It would be hard to do so, but it would be harder to try and deal with the scavengers. He dragged the large mass up to breach the water to see where he was. It was easy to tell where to head as the pool was an easy indicator of where to go. Gang Orca leaned back in his pool chair and breathed in the ocean breeze. He had changed out of his hero outfit and was relaxing and waiting for his intern to come back from his hunt. He wondered what he would go after. There were a myriad of options under the water. He opened his eyes at the sound of a hand slapping on the edge of the pool. Izuku dragged himself over the rim and then reached down with too many tendrils to drag his hunt onto land. A massive shark with a torn-up side and a head that was cut slightly open flopped onto the ground. Gang Orca was sitting up and staring at what his intern had dragged here from who knows how far. Izuku beamed in pride in his successful hunt and his new trophy. He looked over to the hero and motioned to it. "Want some? I was thinking of cooking it up but no woods for fire." He motioned around. "So I figured the cafeteria had a kitchen or something." "Yes, that would be doable." "Did you go after a bull shark?" he asked tentatively. "I did. I saw it and baited it with my blood. It was strong, it almost took my arm off." He opened his arm to show the teeth marks on his bones that he would need to heal. He took a tooth that was still stuck in his arm and wiggled it free. This is a good trophy. His eyes shone and held the tooth the size of his thumb in the air. Gang Orca rubbed the top of his head and shrugged. It's dead already, and Izuku was offering. Alright, we will need help to get this guy into the kitchen. You don't mind sharing your hunt? Izuku shook his head. I already took the first bite and I want to try it cooked. He pointed at a human bite-sized chuck missing. Gang Orca nodded and pulled out his phone and called someone inside for help. Izuku remembered having a phone and pulled it out from his pockets. Thankfully, Nem predicted his carelessness about getting it wet and got a heavy-duty phone that will survive his adventures. He played around with it until he found the camera app and took a picture of him beaming a smile with the torn-up shark behind him and the hero in a Hawaiian shirt motioning to the shark with one hand and the other on a phone. He grinned at the picture and sent it to his contacts. A few minutes later, a crew rolled out of the doors to the poolside with a large cart for the shark. The 6 sidekicks and cooks stopped at seeing the massive animal, and then they looked at the cart that seemed too small in comparison. They crowded around the shark and looked at their boss for an explanation. He raised his hands in surrender and pointed at Izuku, who was munching on one of the fins he had cut off the shark. He noticed their stares and misinterpreted the looks for help. Oh, let me help you. Izuku got close and looked at where they were supposed to put it. What if we cut it into parts? Izuku's arm shifted into a large blade and positioned it to slice it in half. One of the cooks shouted, "Wait, wait, wait." He stopped Izuku and pointed at 2 sections. Here and here. He pointed at the head and where the tail begins to narrow. Izuku nodded and sliced it perfectly where he was indicated. They were able to position the shark parts on the cart and they walked inside with many people staring after the group headed to the kitchen. Izuku skipped along next to the hero, who chucked softly at the display. The feral boy looked at his phone to see people messaging him and then calling him. Mostly Nem, Mina, and Kachan. He tried to read them, but another message popped up when he tried to respond and the calls blocked him from trying to answer them. He grew frustrated and managed to shut it off to the laughter of Gang Orca. The meal the cooks prepared for the whole agency was very satisfying for Izuku. He enjoyed every bite of cooked shark. When everyone found out it was the small green-haired boy that grew horns one day was the one who brought in the shark, they mostly were disbelieving or shocked. The ones who took in stride gave their thanks to a smiling Izuku. After the shark meal cooked by the cafeteria staff, Izuku went to his room to sleep. He turned on his phone again to see dozens of messages and missed calls, mostly from Nem and Mina. He only had a few from Shinso and the others. Shinso gave up on trying to contact him and just sent him a "nice job" sticker in his messages. He was going to respond to Mina through a message when another call came in from Nem. "Hi, Nem." That is all he got out. "Izuku, I swear I will lock you in your room when you get back if you turn off your phone again," she said through clenched teeth. She let out a sigh and continued more calmly. "I know you like to hunt. Just be careful." "Okay, I will," Izuku said, chastised. "Good, how was your day?" she asked more normally now. "Great, I got to stop 2 thugs, Gang called it a mugging. One tried to run, but I hunted him down. It was fun." Izuku switched and said cheerily. "That's great, I'm glad you are learning while you're out there." Izuku could hear her smile from his end. He beamed in pride. "Gang also taught me how to use my presence. That thing that animal quirks people get scared from." They talked for a bit longer, and Nem let Izuku rest for the night. He was happy to hear from her again and did feel somewhat bad when he shut them out because the phone didn't stop making noise. He messaged Mina, and they chatted for a bit before Mina had to go to sleep for the next day. Izuku followed suit and curled up on the tatami mat with a blanket. The next day, Izuku woke up the same as always and flexed his whole body to start the day. He sat up and looked around. He picked up his newest trophy and admired it. That also reminded him that he needed to fix his arm where the shark bit into him. His flesh and muscles pulled back right above his elbow and saw the jagged teeth indents left by the shark. He focused on filling in and closing the teeth marks. While it wasn't a detriment to his efficiency, he liked to be as best as he could be. Once done, he changed into his hero suit and met up with Gang Orca for some sparring. Izuku and Gang Orca walked the streets of the city. The feral boy happily walked along with his mentor and observed everything there was to see. Civilians gave Izuku a smile in return as they passed him and Gang Orca a wave. Gang Orca stopped and touched his ear, listening to something on his earpiece. Izuku stopped and waited for Gang Orca to finish. When he did, he looked around and found a street. He motioned for Izuku to follow. The hero began to run with Izuku by his side and kept up without much effort. There was a car crash, and we've been called to help. Being a hero doesn't just mean protecting others from crime but also helping others in situations like this. Maybe we need to help in fire and help get people out, or something as simple as helping a child find their parent in a crowd. Gang Orca explained as they ran and got closer to the sound of sirens. Izuku nodded and took in all the information. How are we going to help here? Not sure yet, but we'll see when we arrive, the hero said, and they sped up. They arrived at the scene, and Gang Orca went to a few civilians trying to pry a car door open with a man passed out behind the steering wheel. Izuku followed, and the people moved aside for the heroes. Gang Orca took hold of the door but couldn't open it. I can do it, Izuku said and pushed past the hero. His arms shifted into claws, and tendrils snaked out of his shoulders to help. The sides of the door where he gripped it bent inwards, and the tendrils did the same by helping Izuku tear the door off its hinges to get access to the driver. Izuku tossed the door to the side without care, and Gang Orca motioned the civilians to move away for the arriving paramedics to pull the man out. The hero motioned Izuku to help with the others trapped in the pile-up. Izuku did so and went around moving cars out of the way by hand while others went for the victims. One particular bad car was crumpled with a woman stuck with no way out. They were planning to wait for the fire department to bring out the jaws of life. Izuku brought his own and moved to help the woman get out. The only visible part of the car was the roof since it was in the middle of the pile-up. 4 cars were perfectly on top of the one to trap the woman inside with no way out. He could hear her crying inside the car through the roof. Hello, my name is Hunter. Can you get away from the roof? I'm gonna cut it open. He tapped on the roof to signify where he was going to start. Yes, please help. The voice was muffled, but Izuku could hear her easily. One hand shifted into a large blade, and Izuku swung it at the edge of the roof. It sliced open like butter, and he moved to cut twice more after tapping where he was going to cut for the benefit of the woman. His hand shifted back into claws, and the hunter jammed his fingers in the first opening and pried the roof like a tin can. Metal screeched, and the inside was visible. One of Izuku's hands shifted to normal, and he helped the crying woman out. Hello. Izuku smiled down at her with his hand outstretched. You're being rescued. The woman took his hand and pulled herself out and embraced Izuku in a hug. Thank you, she sobbed. Izuku patted the woman on the back and carried her to the ground for the paramedics. A crowd had grown slowly, and they cheered for Izuku's actions. He looked up from helping the woman to the cheering people. Izuku tentatively waved with a smile. They cheered louder, and Izuku felt a blush rise at the amount of praise. He moved to help with another car instead of staying. Izuku found Gang Orca helping pull out another man from the wreckage. I think that's everyone. I already checked every car, Izuku said behind Gang. I believe you are correct, wonderful job. Gang Orca ruffled Izuku's hair with a smile. Izuku followed the hero to talk to the police to report what had happened. The feral boy listened to what the hero said but didn't understand much of what he was saying. There were too many technical terms he didn't know. When he finished, Gang Orca made to leave, but he was stopped by a camera crew waving at him. The hero was wary of talking to the news with his feral intern with him. He was sure Izuku wouldn't do anything bad, but the boy hasn't learned the ways of moving around a reporter's nosy questions. Izuku followed along like a duckling and curiously watched the woman with the microphone brush her hair to the side and signal the guy holding the camera. Izuku saw he was aiming it at Gang Orca and stepped to the side, out of the shot. He waved at Izuku, and he misinterpreted it as to move farther away. He did so. Gang Orca, what do you have to tell us about what we see here today? The woman held the microphone to him. From what I was told, a simple accident caused a car pile-up. So far, there have been no fatalities at the scene, he said simply. That's great to hear. And could you tell us who helped you at the scene? The camera panned over to Izuku, who was shifting side to side like a child bored. He stopped when the camera was aimed at him, and attention was on him. He had no clue what to do. Ah, yes, this is my intern, Hunter. He will be working with me for the rest of the week before he returns to school to continue his education and training to become a hero. Gang Orca said, trying not to give out any personal information. Izuku looked between the camera and the hero for guidance. Hunter. That's an interesting name. How did you come up with it? The reporter held the microphone to Izuku's face. He stared at it and then at the woman. Because I like to hunt, and I'm good at it. He explained. Why did you decide to become a hero? Oh, one day, Shinso said he wanted to be one, and I didn't know what else to do. So, instead of staying in my den, I tried out the exam, and now I'm learning to be a hero. Izuku beamed. The two from the news were surprised at his attitude, but the reporter furrowed her brows at one part. Den, what do you mean? My old den. Izuku was cut off by Gang Orca's hand covering his face. Pardon us, we need to continue with our route. Have a good. Did you just lick my hand? That's gross, pup. Gang Orca wiped his hand on his suit. Not a pup. Izuku pouted and skipped along with his mentor. When they were far enough, he asked. Why did you stop me? You shouldn't tell strangers everything about yourself, most especially when those strangers will tell everyone else. The hero explained. But I don't care who knows. It's just something that happened. Izuku shrugged. Gang Orca hummed in thought. Still, it's not bad, but it's still something you shouldn't spread willy-nilly. Okay, I won't. They walked a few steps, and then Izuku spoke again. I'm hungry. Can we find something to eat? I'm quite hungry myself. Let's see what we find. The two began to scan and smell for their next meal. After their large meal, the day continued with the two patrolling the area. Izuku helped a cat down from a tree by climbing it like a cat himself. The old woman was very grateful to the feral boy and was prized with a hard candy that he bit into immediately, not knowing what it was. Gang Orca stopped and let a gaggle of children swarm him near a park as Izuku wrestled with a few of the animal-quirked kids. When it was time to go, Izuku stood up from under a pile of children with ease, causing most of them to tumble off and laugh. He plucked one girl holding onto his horns and riding his shoulders off of himself and set her down with the others. Time for me to go. Now, shoo, pups. Izuku waved them away with a smile. You're a pup. The girl that was on his shoulders said and pointed at him with her feathers puffed out. She ran off with the other children with a giggle. Izuku joined Gang Orca again and he waved at all the children and some of the parents. He was beaming the whole while they left. Gang Orca eyed him and chuckled. You're very good with children. The hero stated. Are you interested in having some of your own someday? He tried to tease his intern. I do. At least 3. Izuku nodded decisively. He hummed and said. I should ask Mina about that. The hero smiled at the boy. How about saving that question for an appropriate time or until you two have matured more? He patted the boy's head. Izuku nodded. All right. They walked for a while longer as the sun began to set. It was getting close to dark and they were headed back to the agency for the day. As they walked, Izuku noticed a store window with a TV playing the news. He stopped and watched for a moment. Hey, gang. What do we do if one city gets attacked? Do we stay or go and help? Izuku asked. What are you talking about? He turned to see the feral boy pointing at the TV and the news report of Hosu being attacked. That's not good. His brows furrowed in concern. They watched for a bit longer and Izuku recognized the thing attacking. That's a Nomu, like at the USJ, but it looks different. The hero pulled out his phone and made a call. He asked the other person on the line for any information on what was happening in Hosu. He didn't get much and was disgruntled as he hung up. There's limited information at the moment. As for your first question, we stay where we are for the time being. If they call for backup, I would go, or if they call for me specifically for some reason. It would be doubtful that they will call us since Hosu is quite far away from here. Izuku nodded and watched the news as heroes fought back against the Nomu and worked on putting out fires. He felt uneasy watching the chaos on the TV. He was brought out of his thoughts by Gang Orca motioning them to head back to the agency. After finishing up the paperwork with Gang Orca, Izuku headed off into the ocean for another smaller hunt. He dove into the water as his webbed fingers appeared and his legs merged to make a large tail fin. He sped through the water and found a small school of fish. He dove through the clump and tendrils speared many on his way through. He returned to the pool's edge and sat on it while munching on his after-dinner snack. He pulled out his phone to see if he could find a way to get the news on his phone. He gave up after 5 minutes and ended up getting information about the local karaoke bars. He didn't even know what that was. Izuku went to bed after chatting with his friends and saying goodnight to his mate. The morning after, Gang Orca informed him about the aftermath of Hosu. The Nomu were dealt with the help of the number 2 hero. There were many injured but only one fatality at the hands of Stain the hero killer. He took the opportunity of killing a small-time hero during the chaos of the attack. Is that villain strong? Izuku asked about Stain. The hero sighed and spoke. He is unknown. We don't know about his quirk, abilities, or why he is killing heroes. He attacks his targets while they are secluded and usually in alleyways. Like a hunter, but for people, a people hunter, Izuku said and hummed in thought. What does he hunt? You said it yourself, people. What kind of people? Are they good heroes? Bad heroes? Boys? Girls? The hero paused and thought about it. There might be a correlation between them. Izuku nodded. What does correlation mean? The hero smiled and explained the definition while getting up and heading to his office. Let's go see what the victims might have in common. Izuku followed his mentor and sat on the comfortable large couch that didn't make a sound as he set his whole weight behind it. He saw the many pictures in his office and got up to inspect them. Many of them were of him with other people the feral boy didn't recognize. The printer spun to life as it spewed out many leaves of paper with information about the victims of Stain. Izuku didn't know any of them, of course. He helped the hero separate the heroes by the city they died in a timeline. On the surface, nothing was evident except none of the heroes were big figures in the industry. The main pattern Izuku and Gang Orca noticed was that Stain killed 3 in each city and moved on. There's not much to go on. The hero said. Maybe Stain didn't like that they were small-time heroes and just wanted to kill them for fun. Izuku shrugged. Or maybe he didn't like how they worked. What do you mean? The hero furrowed his brow. Like, maybe the heroes were bad at doing their job or doing bad things. You said you went to schools to tell pups not to do bad things, maybe these guys didn't or something. The hero hummed and began to type away on his computer to pull up information about the heroes. The more that he looked, the more commonality was shown between the heroes. They all had minor scandals, bad dealing, or looked down upon for some reason or another. What's a scandal? Izuku asked with a tilt of his head. Stuff coming out about someone good and turns out they are bad. Like them stealing money or adult things. He said delicately. Adult things. Oh, like sex and stuff. Yes, sex and stuff. He chuckled. That's what I'm going to call scandals from now on. Gang Orca gathered the information he discovered and made a report for the Hero Network to see. He attached his hero's name and who helped him make the discovery. He smiled at seeing his intern's name next to his and hit send. He was very proud of having discovered such a bright child. Gang, I didn't know you were a doctor. The feral child pointed at the hero's doctorate diploma on the wall. I'm going to miss you, Gang. Izuku hugged the big hero before he left for the train station. The hero was a bit flustered at being hugged in the middle of his lobby with everyone giving him sweet smiles to teasing smirks. He hugged the child back anyway. It's been a pleasure to have you around. If you need any help, remember you have a way to contact me. You'll always be welcomed back. Izuku let go and nodded. He waved at everyone else in the lobby before leaving out the doors. He looked around before pulling out his phone and setting the course for the station. Nimari stood waiting at the train station in her civilian clothes waiting for Izuku to arrive. The train she had been waiting for came and she looked around to find the feral child. She spotted him and squealed at seeing him. She grabbed him and pulled him into a hug. It's so nice to see you again. Izuku looked up from the embrace and beamed a smile at her. And what are these? She grabbed his head and looked at the horns. Horns. I grew them, Izuku said letting her move his head around. I can see that, She gently touched them and thought about who else had horns. With a smirk. Was this because of Mina? She asked teasingly. I liked her horns and wanted my own. Nem smiled down at him. I think they suit you. Come on, let's go home. A couple of hours later, Izuku stretched in the dirt of his den. He made a sound of contentment at being back in his den. While it was nice to see a new place, he did miss his own space and furs. On the way back, he told Nem about his time with Gang Orca and what he had learned. She listened and asked questions about everything. Izuku was also happy to see Nem again, he had grown quite fond of her. He got up from his dirt floor and pulled out his latest trophy, the large shark's tooth. He smiled victoriously and set it next to the sports festival medal. After that, he went for a hunt. He shifted into his hunter form and prowled his territory for his prey. He leapt from tree to tree in search of a suitable lunch. His claws quietly thunked into the trunk of one tree and halted to watch the deer tilt its head to see if it could find what made the sound again. A few minutes of stillness later, they went back to grazing on the greens of the woods. The hunter ever so slowly got closer and closer until he was right above his prey without alerting them. In a flash, he dove at his prey and speared it through the heart to end it quickly. The deer cried in pain for a moment, but it was done. The hunter hummed in pleasure at the successful hunt and dressed the deer before bringing it back to his den to cook. Izuku happily skipped through the halls of UA to his classroom. He had missed his friends. He opened the door to 1A and greeted everyone inside. Kachan, your hair looks weird. He didn't notice the stares from his other classmates. Kachan for his part stared dumbly at his old friend. More specifically, he stared at the two horns on his head. The fuck is on your head? Don't say bad words, he admonished. What do you mean? He asked. What do you mean? What do I mean? The horns, he practically shouted at Izuku. They heard a squeal from the entrance and turned to see Mina sprint from the door to Izuku. She hugged him and then pulled his head down to see his horns. You grew horns. I did, Izuku beamed. They look so cool. Now we match. She pulled him into a side hug and pressed her cheek to his as she snapped a picture with her phone. Izuku beamed at her and soon after greeted Jiro and Shoji, who walked through the doors together. They both smiled in greeting and also complimented Izuku's horns. The rest of the class took their energy in stride and they went about their day. Shiro and Kaminari laughed at Kachan's combed hair while Shinso came in with slow steps. The bags under his eyes were evident as he slumped into his desk. He greeted everyone without looking up. When he did finally focus his eyes, he stared incredulously at his friend. I was going to ask about the shark, but now I want to ask about the horns. Shark? Shiro asked nearby. I grew them myself, Izuku stated proudly. Jiro snorted a laugh in the feral child's response. As you do. Hold up, I'm with Shiro here. What about a shark? Kaminari asked. I hunted one, Izuku said excitedly. Most of the class was silent at his proclamation. What kind of shark? Kirishima asked. A big one. It almost took my arm off. Izuku tried to measure it out with his hands but couldn't. He sent a picture. Here. Jiro pulled her phone out and everyone crowded around Kirishima holding her phone. There were many cries of shock at the size of the animal and more laughter at seeing Gang Orca in a Hawaiian shirt gesturing at the sea predator. Izuku's beaming face took up half of the screen. That's a bull shark. How did you hunt a bull shark? Sato asked incredulously. It's massive too, Kirishima said in awe. I learned how to grow gills. Izuku said with a smile and showing off his neck opening up and gills appearing. They opened and closed a few times. After I learned how to do this, I swam around until I found that. He pointed at the phone. I baited it with my blood and then it bit me. Aizawa was standing at the doorway to the classroom and stared with dead eyes at the literal feral child telling his story about wrestling with a shark and taking bites out of it while his arm was still in its jaws. And then, Gang got some people to drag it to the kitchen to cook it up. It was nice. He smiled in remembering the taste of the shark. Most of the class was dumbfounded at the absurdity of their small classmate hunting down a shark and fighting it to death. Did it taste good? Kaminari asked first. Many of the guys nodded their heads in agreement with the question. Get to your seats, Aizawa finally said with such a defeated tone that the class worried for his mental health. I'm glad to see all of you are still alive. He looked at the feral child and he beamed back. Now, midterms are coming up in a few weeks. Start preparing. He walked out and Smentos walked in to start classes. The class lined up in front of All Might in Hero class. Great to see you all again. For today, we are doing a race to the civilian. I am playing the civilian and groups of 5 will race to where I wait for my rescuers. Keep collateral damage to a minimum. He stared at Kachan. Trying to say something, All Might. The blonde challenged. Izuku hopped from paw to paw in excitement at racing his classmates. He waited in anticipation as All Might leapt away to a distant tower and the screen flashed with 5 names. The feral boy squealed in joy at being in the first group. He lined up with the others and waited to sprint. The others waiting for their turns were infected by Izuku's enthusiasm and also began to get excited. Go! All Might bellowed and Izuku was off with the concrete under his feet cracked from his departure. He dove forward and in midair, his body shifted. Groves were torn into the ground with each limb connecting with the ground. Izuku grinned with joy at having his hair blow back from the speed and the enjoyment of being in the lead. Until Zero swung at high speeds past him. Izuku cried in outrage and speed up to pass him. He climbed up pipes like he had been doing so for years and leapt from foothold to foothold without hesitation. His 4 eyes traced every path he could take in an instant. When there were no footholds, he made them. He clawed up the surface of the concrete wall to reach the number 1 hero to win. He heard the tape getting closer and Izuku pushed himself to place first. 2 tendrils shot out of his shoulders and yanked him up to All Might. He was met with All Might's grinning face and Izuku roared in triumph. He could hear his classmates cheer from the distance and he reveled in it. Damn, so close. Zero pouted. No bad words. A dozen voices admonished Zero from one mouth. No bad words. Zero put up his hands in surrender and backed away with a smile at his classmate. Mina crawled over the ledge of the race and breathed in heavily from the exertion. Zuku, you left me behind, she pouted. Izuku shifted back with tearing flesh and breaking bones. She didn't even bat an eye as he tilted his head in confusion. But it was a race. She couldn't hold her pout and hugged Izuku for his adorable behavior. I know, just trying to tease you. Izuku beamed at the hug and sat down to wait for the others to arrive. Mina moved behind him and began to play with his hair. He could feel her untangle the messy hair and begin to braid it. He hummed in pleasure at the feeling and relaxed under her touch. He heard the last 2 arrive and All Might called forward the next group. Iida smiled at Izuku. He passed him and sat beside the feral boy. The first to arrive was Tokiyami with Yaoyorozu close behind him. Kaminari and Aoyama arrive at the same time with Kaminari breathing more easily than the flamboyant boy. Yaomomo, can you make me some hair ties? Mina asked the heiress. Sure. Her hand glowed and a dozen hair ties landed on Mina's outstretched hand. Thanks. Mina continued her work on her mate. Izuku extended a tendril with an eye at the end to see what she was doing but Mina batted it away. No peeking. Izuku pouted. How many eyes can you make? Kaminari asked curiously. Izuku responded by opening a dozen eyes on one side of his face and all look at Kaminari. A lot. The smile only made Kaminari's pale face pale even further. That is terrifying, All Might said from the side. All the eyes swiveled to him and he grimaced slightly. Young Izuku, please stop. More eyes popped between the other eyes just for fun. You're grounded, the number 1 hero said. All the eyes closed. Grounded, what's that? As Mina chortled a laugh at both the question and All Might's grounding. How can you ground him? What's the punishment? Iida chopped his hands. All Might was a bit flustered at the question. Izuku never left the grounds and didn't have games to take away. He was distracted by Izuku on his phone. What does grounded mean? All Might said I was grounded. All Might looked around in a panic to see an escape and then leapt away to another location for the next group. Oh, he just jumped away, Izuku said to the phone. Mina and Kaminari cackled in laughter at seeing the number 1 hero run away. Yaoyorozu looked surprised at the sudden action of the hero and looked at Izuku hanging up the call. Does Miss Kayama scare All Might? She asked. I guess, but she's always nice to me. Except for that one time I turned off my phone, she was mad. Izuku said sullenly. All done. Mina patted Izuku's head. Izuku touched his hair and felt the braids. An eye extended from his neck to see the results. His eyes shone at the new hairstyle. Whoa, that's cool. Izuku beamed at his mate. She beamed in return and puffed her chest out proudly. The last group had just finished and All Might yelled to them. Now one last race. All at once, he leapt to the gate where they started. Go. Chaos erupted as the other group of 10 sabotaged each other to get ahead. Izuku's group was no different. The feral boy tried to leap off the platform to get ahead but tripped as Zero's tape bound his legs. He fell off the platform but caught himself with his claws digging into the walls. Izuku roared in a challenge and Zero cried in horror at what he had just done. Tendrils tore the tape apart and he leapt after the black-haired boy frantically trying to get away from the beast on his heels. He tried to slow him down again by shooting tape behind him but Izuku's tendrils slashed it apart. I'm sorry, Zero cried and yelped in fear as another roar came from Izuku's mouth. Izuku caught up to the tape slinger and grabbed him before throwing him back the way he had come. He saw him do cartwheels in the air for a moment before catching himself on his tape sloppily. The hunter laughed in pleasure and turned back around to win the race. He could hear explosions from the other group and he saw ice shoot forward. He moved trajectory to cross paths with them to slow them down as Zero had done to him. He saw them. Kachan blasted an ice pillar in midair with a feral smile. The smile was wiped off his face when Izuku bodily tackled his old friend in midair and threw him back. You son of a bitch! Kachan roared in the distance. Izuku cackled in joy and tore up the ground to throw at Todoroki to slow him. It worked and he sped up to win. He was getting close and had his eyes open to see behind him to see who was nearing him. It was Tokiyami with dark shadow propelling him forward. Izuku grinned a savage grin and focused on his presence to show predatory implications if he got closer. The bird-headed boy backed away immediately and Izuku turned his presence back to normal. He skidded to a stop next to All Might and roared his victory again. All Might patted Izuku's head with a laugh. One by one, the rest of the class arrived next to All Might and Izuku. Kachan didn't slow down and bodily tackled Izuku in return. The feral boy went with the impact and they rolled around on the ground until Izuku overpowered his old friend and pinned him. Kachan responded by biting into Izuku's arm and refusing to lose. The feral boy yelped and let the blonde get his arms around his head. You little shit, Kachan growled. Bad words. Izuku laughed under his arm. Alright, that's enough, All Might said, breaking the brotherly scene before him. While I didn't expect the subverting actions, it showed spirit. Great job everyone. He beamed before leaping away. Kachan still didn't let go of Izuku for his treachery and grabbed him by his horns. Izuku responded by kicking his friend's feet from under him and slipping out as he fell. Izuku cackled as he ran to the locker room to change. Kachan roared at the indignation and chased after him. The fuck just happened? Shinso asked, flabbergasted at the actions of the bomber. Mina pointed at Zero. He tripped up Zuku at the beginning and he chased him down to get revenge. I'm guessing he did the same to Kachan too. She giggled. Zero, what reason did you have to stoop so low? Iida chopped his hands. I wanted to win. And guys, you know no terror until Izuku is chasing you down in his other form. He looked haunted at the memory. He had cute braids. Who did that? Uraraka asked, ignoring Zero's PTSD. He did, Toru agreed. Zuku was almost purring when I played with his hair. Mina squealed to the other girls as they made their way to their locker room. Let's go before they destroy the locker room. Shoji chuckled. The class met back up in the classroom before they left for the day. Aizawa was glaring at the feral child with singed hair and a smile and the blonde in front of him grumbling under his breath. There were a few scattered giggles but they stopped when the teacher turned on the rest of the class. After a silent moment, he spoke. Midterms are coming up, prepared accordingly. There will be a practical and written exam. Those who pass will be able to attend a training camp during the break. The class broke out into chatter about what he had said. Izuku naturally had questions. What are midterms? Are they like tests? He asked no one in particular. It's to make sure you are learning what we teach you. Aizawa drawled out. Izuku shrugged. Makes sense. He understood what the concept of a training camp was by the individual words. Yaoruzo stood excitedly and said to the class, "You all can join me at my home for study sessions." Many looked grateful and a few others refused, saying they studied alone. "Can I join?" Izuku asked, just as excited. "Of course." She paused and asked, "Where did you rank in the written entrance exam?" Izuku shrugged and turned to the teacher. "Zawa, where did I rank?" The teacher gave him a murderous glare and grit out, "Third, you brat." "Third." Izuku turned back the impressed heiress. "Third, how the fuck did you place higher than me? You've been in a hole in the ground for a decade." Kachan bellowed. Izuku shrugged again with a smirk. "I'm just smarter than you." Kachan lunged at him, but Izuku dodged easily and dove out the open window with a cackle. Aizawa had had enough and walked out of the classroom. "I'm done." "Oh, he left his bag," Shinso said, picking up Izuku's bag. "Do you know where his den is?" Shiro asked, watching the feral boy disappear in the tree line. "I don't know if he would like it if we arrived at his doorstep unannounced." Iida stepped in. "Zuku, you left your bag, do you want the class to see your den?" Everyone turned to Mina on the phone with a smile. She beamed and hung up after a kiss to the microphone. He said, "It's fine, let's go." Shinso was already walked out the door with his friend's bag in hand. Most of the class looked at each other and many of the boys eagerly followed to see where Izuku liked to sleep. Yaoruzo followed quickly behind in curiosity about the class president's abode. Soon, everyone was following Shinso, Mina, Shoji, and Jiro through the woods to Izuku's territory, while the owner of the territory prowled over them in the trees for fun. The class walked into the clearing with the large pond and the tree hanging over a part of it. There were many gasps of awe at the serene sight as the small group of friends showed them Izuku's home. "Zuku, where are you?" Mina yelled out in a sing-song voice. "He's been following us since we entered the forest," Jiro said and pointed behind everyone. Everyone turned and some shrieked in fright at seeing their smallest classmate standing silently with a beaming smile. Kaminari was clutching his heart as Shiro held on to Sato, who was very amused. "Welcome. I'm happy to have you all visit." Izuku beamed and moved around them to show them his den. "You can go wherever you want. Even inside my den if you want to see, I don't mind." Tendrils pulled the makeshift door to the side and pointed down. "Is it okay? It seems personal to go into your sleeping area." Yaoruzo asked for everyone. "Yep, so long as you don't take anything, I'm fine with it. I'll be back with food." Izuku darted off before anyone could say anything and they heard the faint sound of cracking bone and tearing flesh. Shinso sat down on a log and got comfortable while setting his bag to the side and Izuku's by his den. "Hope you guys are hungry, he's probably going to bring back a few deer at least." Kachan was one of the first ones to peek inside Izuku's den and jump down into it. He found the hole in the ground homey and could understand why his old friend preferred it to a room. He was joined by some others, also curious about where their feral classmates slept. Kachan moved to the wall lined with animal skulls and other trinkets. He immediately recognized it as his trophies, had to admit to himself that it was pretty cool. Izuku returned in his hunter form with one deer on each shoulder. Most of his class looked on with a bit of surprise, but they went along with their classmate making dinner for them. A loud clap of the hands drew attention to Sato, smiling with his uniform shirt off and his white tank top showing. "I haven't butchered anything ever since my uncle took me to his shop for the summer, but I still remember how to do so." He offered his help in preparing the meal. Izuku's smile grew more and he moved over to a large tree. A tendril extended and a javelin was jabbed into the tree trunk. He hung up one deer and set the other on the other side. He shifted back and held out a knife made of his steel-covered bones to Sato and he nodded gratefully. Shinso whispered something to Yaoruzo and she shrugged and produced 2 containers filled with salt and pepper. Izuku narrowed his eyes at his friend but went to prepare the fire. He set the bonfire alight quickly and then he built it up bigger. Nodding in satisfaction, he returned to the other deer. "I have to say, Izuku, this is a very nice home you have," Sue said, soaking in the sun and dipping her feet in the water of the pond. She looked completely content with Uraraka joining her at her side. "Yeah, bro, this is pretty awesome." Hiroshima nodded along while he sat by the fire. "It is peaceful." Yaoruzo smiled and looked around at the clearing. She turned back to making some utensils for them to use and plate. "By the way, How do you plan to cook that? Izuku paused and looked at her and then the chopped up deer. Probably on skewers. He placed a deer leg on one and stuck it into the ground for example. Shinso quickly moved to it and seasoned it. Much better. Don't you give me that look. Shinso said as Izuku curled his lip at his friend. Yaoyorozu made a container for the pieces that Sato was cutting off and preparing them for the fire. Mina did the same for Izuku and helped him take parts of the deer and set them to cook. Meanwhile, most of the class relaxed in the clearing and chatted happily. Soon the aroma of cooked meat began to waft into the area and everyone's mouth began to water. Izuku beamed at seeing everyone enjoy the deer he had caught while talking between themselves. He took a leg of the deer and sat to eat with Mina plopping down to his side and enjoying her portion. She smiled warmly up at him and leaned on his side while watching everyone eat and share his territory. Kaminari leaned back with a full belly and said to everyone, "I don't know about you guys, but that was great." There were many sounds of agreement. While I would like to enjoy this much longer, we should plan out the study sessions for the midterms, Yaoyorozu said and Iida nodded with her as there were groans from many others. She chuckled and pulled out a pen and notebook from her bag and began to write down how many would join her at her home. Once it was getting close to the sun setting, everyone helped out to clean up after themselves and thank Izuku for his hospitality and the meal. The feral boy beamed brilliantly to them all and told them that they were welcome any time. Mina was the only one to stay after everyone else had left to enjoy some time with her mate. "This is nice. It's a good home, Zuku," she while picking up his arm and putting it around her shoulder. "It is nice, I chose it myself," he said with pride. She giggled and relaxed at the peace of the moment. They stayed in companionable silence for a long moment until Mina's phone rang and she looked at the message from her mother. She sighed and got out from under his arm and got up. "It's time for me to go, walk me out," she asked smiling down at him. Izuku returned the smile to his mate and helped her out of the forest and through the halls of Ua. They chatted a little about the study group that will take place in Yaoyorozu's home later in the week and what her home would be like. Mina was the most excited to see the size of the home and Izuku began to get curious himself. They reached the gates of the school and Mina turned to him with a slight blush. "It's only right to send me properly as your mate." Izuku nodded and agreed with her. "How do I do that?" He stopped nodding and asked. She giggled at his behavior. With a hug, she wrapped her arms around his waist and Izuku returned it happily. She pulled away with more color on her cheeks. And a kiss. She pecked him on the lips. She pulled away again to see his reaction and she was pleased to see his slightly dazed expression. She giggled once more and turned to leave. "See you tomorrow," with a beaming smile. Behind the second-floor windows, the staff watched the interaction between the two young mates. "Hot damn." She left him speechless. Snipe said with a guffaw and a hearty laugh. "It is quite nice to see young love." Small Mite said with a warm smile at the scene. "It's so heartwarming it could bring you to Nem." "Are you crying?" Present Mike asked shocked. Between sobs she said, "He's growing up so fast." She continued to sob into her hands while Vlad King patted her shoulder, trying to comfort her but he backed away when she spoke again. That girl better not hurt him. She looked up again with narrowed eyes at the retreating form of Mina. The other staff reeled at the sudden change in her attitude and prayed for Mina Ishido's safety that she would indeed not hurt the boy they had all grown attached to in the short time they had known him. An hour later, Hitoshi Shinso was seated in the living room with his mother watching a movie. His phone rang and he looked at the screen with furrowed brows and some concern. His mother paused the movie after seeing his concern. "Who is it?" she asked with her own concern rising. "It's Izuku." "Well, answer. It might be important." She had been given the story of her son's mysterious friend that day he came back with staff from Ua. She had also broken down in tears after hearing his retelling and hugged her son tight at the mere idea of her son having to do what Izuku had done to survive. She still hasn't met with the boy, but she was excited for the day she will get to meet the boy that befriended her son. Hitoshi did so and immediately heard Izuku almost screaming through the phone's speaker. "Shinso, is it normal to feel dizzy when a girl kisses you?" I asked Nem but she just laughed and didn't answer my question. The brainwasher stared at his phone with an incredulous look and then his eyes flickered to his mother who had her hand slapped over her mouth but he could see the smile hidden behind it. He stuttered out a response to his friend. I don't know. I've never kissed a girl before, he said with tinted cheeks. Why are you calling me for this? I don't know. I was going to call Kachan but I figured to call you first. Hitoshi could hear the shrug in the other line. He sighed and rubbed his face with the other hand. Should you be sharing this? It seems private to the two of you. Is this something I shouldn't talk about? I didn't know that. Alright, I won't tell anyone else. Thanks, Shinso. The friend of the feral boy looked at his phone with an exasperated look in his eyes. His mother burst out into giggles and then laughter. When she had calmed down and looked at her son, told him. You should really invite him over for dinner now, I can't wait to meet him. Her eyes glimmered in amusement. I'll ask after the midterms are done. He sighed with a smile. Good, and when are you going to get a girlfriend of your own, mhhh? She asked teasingly and a wiggle of her eyebrows as she leaned in closer to her son. He pushed her face away. When I feel like it, he said with a reddening face as he turned away from his cackling mother. The weekend that came had Izuku on a train headed to his classmate's home. He had his phone close at hand and reminded himself constantly of the name of the station he would need to get off to continue to his destination. The train came to a stop and he looked around as he walked off the busy station and then looked down at his phone and the indicator of his position. He followed the route indicated and began to walk and look around at the homes that seemed to change with each street. At first, the homes looked slightly bigger than Kachan's, but then they grew in size with each passing structure until Izuku couldn't classify them as homes anymore and instead territories. He daydreamed of one day having his territory as larger than the ones he passed. His phone chimed and he looked down to see that he arrived at his destination. He looked at the massive gates and the structure behind it. He was about to go and push them open when he heard a click of a speaker and he turned to see a black box to the side. What business do you have? A cold voice came from the speaker. I don't own any businesses, he said, confusion lacing his tone. A joker. Then be on your way, the voice said curtly, and the box turned off. Izuku waited and then pushed the black button. Nothing happened, so he kept pushing it until he became annoyed at waiting and turned to the gate. Without having to shift anything, he leapt clear over the gate and began to make his way down the path to the front of the building. About a quarter way there, he heard multiple dogs barking aggressively. He turned to the sound and saw 4 large dogs, almost the size of wolves, charging at him with teeth bared. Izuku stared at the dogs and changed his presence to something less friendly. The dogs stopped barking immediately and began to trip over themselves to stop. When they did and got back up, they had their tails between their legs and whimpered softly. He had changed his presence to show predatory implications if they attacked him, and now he switched it to something akin to an elder to children. The dogs stopped whimpering and slowly got closer and sniffed at his legs. He smiled and knelt to pet the now placid dogs. He giggled when one licked his face and the other tried to push him over playfully. He turned at hearing the gate open and he saw a few of his classmates staring at him with bewildering looks. Uraraka, Jiro, and Ojiro got closer to him to talk. Dude, what are you doing? Jiro asked with a smile, but the smile fell away as the dogs got aggressive at the 3 and began to growl menacingly. The dogs began to whimper again and turned to Izuku. He growled similarly to the dogs and barked out. They are my pack. The dogs walked behind Izuku with their tails between their legs and head down and then sat down. Good, he nodded and then turned to his friends with a smile. The 3 looked shocked at what just transpired and Jiro spoke for the 3 of them. What the fuck was that? She motioned with her finger. Don't say bad words. And I don't know, I jumped the gate, and these guys came at me. They're okay now, he shrugged. You're not supposed to jump the gate. The guy was supposed to buzz it open for you. Didn't he talk to you? Jiro sounded incredulous as he stared at the dogs again with their heads raised but still seated behind Izuku's legs. The guy asked if I owned a business and I told him I didn't, and then he just ignored me. Uraraka slapped her hand over her mouth to stave off the laughter bubbling up. Ojiro's lips quirked up at realizing what probably happened. Jiro sighed. Just forget it, let's go. She sounded defeated but couldn't contain her smile at her friend's antics. Izuku nodded and began to walk with the other 3 as the dogs trotted beside him. They reached the door and an unfamiliar man opened it with a dignified motion and stood at attention. But his poise dropped when he saw the extremely well-trained guard dogs walking beside the boy that was supposed to run him off by dogs. Before he could say anything, Yaoyorozu walked in front of the flabbergasted man and greeted them with a beaming smile. "I'm so glad you are here," she said with her hands clasped together. She looked slightly down at the guard dogs and tilted her head in confusion. "Hi, Ruzo. This is a big territory you have, it needs more trees though," he greeted happily. Her smile came back in full force at the nickname. "I do agree, something similar to your pond would be nice. Come in. But, the dogs must stay outside," she said sheepishly. The others walked in and watched Izuku turn to the dogs by his side and spoke to them. "She is part of my pack too, protect her. Now, off you go." He pointed directly at Yaoyorozu's surprised face. The dogs gave out a low bark and then ran off to where they came from. Izuku nodded with satisfaction and turned to the five faces staring at him. "What?" he asked with a tilt of his head. "So many things." Jiro shook her head. "Since when can you talk to animals?" Uraraka asked. "How did they listen to you?" Yaoyorozu asked. "Pack," the butler asked with furrowed brows. "I can't talk to animals, but I learned how to use my presence at Gang Orcas, and it's really neat. I used that and they listened to me." Then he turned to the old man with a suit. "Yep, I am the pack leader of my class," he said proudly. He means the class president, which is pretty similar to a pack dynamic in the wilderness now that I think about it, Yaoyorozu explained with a tilt of her head and looked into the distance. "Anyways, this way, the others are already here," she said leading them with an excited smile. They walked through a few hallways with the newcomers looking around with awe at the home. She opened a large set of doors to show Kaminari, Mina, and Shiro chatting and seated at a large table. Mina bolted up and hugged Izuku with a blinding smile. He caught her and set her down with his smile just as bright. Soon everyone got situated and Yaoyorozu went around to see who needed help in what subjects. Izuku led his expertise in what he could. Since he didn't learn the standard way of doing things, he showed others his way of solving problems and ways to recall information. For some, it helped immensely, for others, not so much. One subject he could teach a class by himself was biology. Even Yaoyorozu sat down to make notes as Izuku made a diagram showing the human body and every system in it. He had a keen understanding of what did what and how it works thanks to his quirk. The week passed with everyone studying as much as they could for the midterms. Izuku was happy to help whoever came to him and he frequently had visitors in his territory for help. It was nearing the day of the exams when Monoma approached Izuku's table at lunch. Izuku looked up from taking a large bite from his sandwich to see Monoma giving him a smirk. "You should take smaller bites, you'll choke one day. And nice horns." He bit down anyway and smiled victoriously as he chewed and swallowed. "Hey, Noma," he greeted brilliantly. "Thanks, I grew them myself," he said proudly showing off his horns. He chuckled and he said to the table, "Came over here to give you a heads up about the practical exams. I overheard some upperclassmen say that it was robots like the entrance exam." Mina whooped in joy and Izuku deflated. "Robots? That's no fun." The feral boy whined. "Are you sure? That seems too easy." "No." Jiro asked skeptically. "I agree, I would imagine the staff giving us something more challenging than robots." Shoji nodded with Jiro. Monoma raised his hands in surrender. "It's what I've heard, just wanted to let you guys know is all. We'll keep it in mind and tell the others." "Thanks, Noma." Izuku beamed up to his friend from his sister class. As he left, Izuku turned to his friends. "I hope it's not robots," he said hopefully. Izuku stretched his back after finishing the last exam for the day that required him to stay in his seat. He set the laptop he had been using in his bag and stood up. He looked around at his pack and saw that he wasn't the only one relieved to be finished with the tests. The last test of the day is the one he is most excited about, the practical test. With an eager smile, he led everyone to the locker room to change into their suits. "You excited?" Kaminari asked while taking off his shirt. "I can't wait." Izuku beamed and quickly slipped on his shorts, hopping on one leg. "Izuku, my mom wants you to come over after the midterms, do you want to?" Shinso asked. Internally he was apprehensive since Izuku would be the first friend he would have invited over in a long time. But he was sure that his feral friend would be happy to come over. He was proven right by what he said. Of course, I never got to talk to your mom when I saw her last time, he said happily. Shinso smiled and nodded. I'll tell mom to have dinner for tonight. How did you two meet, anyways? Shiro asked. He scared a couple of bullies off when I ran into his territory and I gave him some thank you food afterward, Shinso said, chuckling at the memory. Sato nodded. That fits. They regrouped together and waited for someone to explain the exam to them. While waiting, Izuku was reminded of Asato and wondered how she was doing. He did talk to her once a week on the phone, but he still missed their interactions. Mina gave him the idea of taking a class picture and sending it to her. Izuku beamed at the idea and pulled out his phone. The class overheard what they were saying and was already crowing together. Izuku extended a tendril with his phone in the air and took the picture with everyone smiling. Mina helped him send the picture to everyone in his contacts list. From there, Mina sent it to the rest of the class. They were all happy about the picture. Izuku had gotten a response from Asato almost immediately with a paragraph about how happy she is to see him with friends. Everyone stopped when their pack leader faced down the hallway. His smile grew and he hopped from foot to foot. Around the corner came Aizawa with the rest of the staff. Nezu popped out of his scarf and greeted everyone. Hello, everyone. We decided to do something a bit different for your practical exam, he said cheerfully. We get to fight you guys, Izuku blurted out. Everyone turned to him and Nezu laughed. Very astute, Izuku. Yes, for your practical exams, you will be fighting one of your teachers, paired off with another classmate, he said while throwing his arms up in the air. Izuku squealed with glee while some of the class groaned. The green-haired boy pointed directly at Aizawa with a feral smile. I wanna fight you, in the woods, he almost demanded. Eraserhead's quirk activated and glared at Izuku. Quiet, you won't get to choose. The pairing has already been decided upon. Izuku pouted and Nem giggled at his face. Mina hooked her arm with his and patted it. Don't worry, Zuku. One day you'll get your chance. The pairing was announced until it was just Kacchan and Izuku left with no more staff left to choose. Izuku gasped. We get to fight all of you. There was a booming laugh and All Might landed before the class. No, you will be fighting me, he said with some menacing inclinations. Izuku shook Kacchan's shoulders. Kacchan, we get to fight, All Might, he said with glee. The blonde batted his hands away. I can fucking hear just fine. Izuku pinched his arm and he jerked away while rubbing at the spot. Stop saying bad words. Kacchan looked indignantly at his old friend. You little shit. Don't pinch me, what are you? 5. The blonde lunged at him to get his revenge and Izuku dodged easily with a grin. Everyone watched for a moment as they roughhoused around until Nezu got everyone's attention again. Now, let's begin. Everyone was split off to go fight their teachers and All Might grabbed the scruff of the neck of the two on the ground to pull them away. Kacchan twisted around like a feral animal as the number one hero laughed. Izuku just let himself get dragged away with a laugh. Mina split off from Kaminari and pecked Izuku on the cheek. Good luck, she smiled sweetly at him as he was dragged away by the symbol of peace. Izuku beamed at her. Good luck. The three boarded the bus and headed to their arena for their exam. Izuku sat next to Kacchan and eyed All Might suspiciously at the front of the bus. He is super strong, right? He asked his old friend. Kacchan nodded with pursed lips. He is strong, fast, and super durable. Like, how strong? He could level a few city blocks with one punch if he truly wanted. Think of that Nomu you took down at the USJ, like that, maybe more. He explained. Izuku hummed in thought and stared at the back of the hero's head. The hero's smile strained as he felt the predatory gaze of his student. He has a smell of fresh blood from his side. An old injury that never healed right, I'm guessing. His face is still a weakness, his eyes, nose, and ears could distract him if we go for them. He thought out loud. Kacchan snapped his eyes into Izuku. Injury. I've never heard of him getting hurt, much less something as serious, he said with furrowed brows. Izuku shrugged. That's what I smell. The bus came to a stop and everyone got off in front of a faux city. All Might stretched for a moment and then gave them a salute before bounding into the distance. Izuku did the same by stretching his muscles underneath his skin. They wriggled around like snakes and then he sighed in relief. Kacchan stared at him with his mouth slightly open and his brows furrowed at the scene before him. He shook his head and focused on the city before them. I want to beat him, Kacchan said. Izuku beamed at his friend and nodded. Then let's beat him. He pumped his fist like he had seen others do. Kacchan smiled at his old friend and nodded. I can blind him with a flash bang. After that, we can continue to overwhelm him with attacks. The buzzer went off to signal the start of the exam. Izuku turned to the center of the city and began to jog with Kacchan. His ears picked up a sound and his hawk-like eyes saw the wave of destruction coming their way. He yanked Kacchan behind him with tendrils and keratin shields formed from each arm. He made a wedge and slammed it into the ground while carapace-like legs shot out behind him to hold him steady. The wave of wind and debris hit and washed around them. When it dies down, Izuku peeked with an eye that opened on the exterior of the shield. He absorbed the mass and stood before the devastation of what All Might wrought. They heard a booming laugh. Why would a villain care for collateral damage? Izuku nodded. That makes sense. He turned to Kacchan and grinned. Let's go. Kacchan's grin was just as feral and he blasted along Izuku as he shifted into his hunter form. The hunter got on all fours with claws that dug furrows into the ground with each step. Izuku added some modifications to his body by growing spines like a porcupine and a whip-like tail with a spear tip. Throw me, Kacchan bellowed. Izuku didn't hesitate and grabbed his friend by the waist with a tendril that extended from his hand. He twisted in midair and the tendril whipped Kacchan at breakneck speed at the hero. With a bestial roar, 3 streaks shot past Kacchan to impact All Might, who shielded his body with his arms. The javelins collided with the hero with a jarring force that caused him to step back and wince at the pain of the tips digging into his flesh. When he lowered his arms to engage with Kacchan, he was blinded by a bright flash directly into his face. All Might reeled back in pain and clutched at his eyes as Kacchan blasted over the hero's head and got on his other side to send a barrage of explosions at him. Izuku leapt with all his might and collided with the hero, causing him to stumble at the dense high-speed body slam. Izuku didn't let go and dug his claw into his shoulder to hold on while his other hand shifted into a heavy spiked fist. He got off a few punches in his face before All Might blindly grabbed Izuku's hand and threw him into a building. He broke through the first brick wall and the second. Kacchan was backhanded away the next moment and was sent sprawling across the asphalt. He skipped across it and righted himself before All Might leapt towards his general direction, still half blind. Izuku pulled himself out of the rubble and hissed in pain at the cuts. They closed up quickly and the glass was ejected from his body. He sprinted through the holes he created and redirected himself toward the fight. Kacchan was dodging around All Might, who was slowly recovering from the first attack. Izuku came barreling in with his arm outstretched and became something he hadn't used in combat yet. The claw reeled back and hit All Might on his injured side. The sound was deafening as the mantis shrimp claw impacted with tremendous force, causing All Might to be launched into a building just like he had done to Izuku. The hunter roared in triumph and slammed his claw into the ground, caught up in the moment. Kacchan looked between Izuku and the hole All Might went through before shaking himself and focusing on the battle. He aimed his gauntlet at the still intact building that All Might was still recovering inside of and pulled the pin. The large explosion ripped out of his gauntlet and destroyed what was left of the structural supports, causing it to collapse on top of the symbol of peace. The 2 students stared at the rubble of the building and the dust settling down. They looked at each other and then back at the rubble. Izuku was about to speak when the rubble shifted and All Might stood from the debris. Izuku pulled back his arm for another javelin throw but stopped when All Might raised his free hand. The other clutched at his side. That's enough, I surrender, the hero said and sat down on the curb. The buzzer went off and exclaimed that they had passed. Izuku shifted back and ran up to All Might with worry. Are you all right? He looked between his bleeding side and his coughing up blood. Kacchan stared at the number 1 hero in some fear. You're really hurt, he stated. All Might looked up at the other student with a stained smile. Keep this to yourself. With a puff of smoke, Toshinori Yagi sat where All Might once did. Kachan stepped back in shock and then looked to Izuku, who didn't seem fazed. What's going on? His quirk makes him All Might. Izuku shrugged in explanation. But, how? Kachan still looked confused and conflicted by seeing the strongest hero shrink down to an emaciated man. Yagi chuckled and waved him off. It's all right, young Izuku is right. My quirk allowed me to become the symbol of peace. But in my old age, it's coming to an end. This injury isn't helping either. Oh, Kachan said quietly. Don't worry so much, young Bakugo. The reason I chose to become a teacher is to guide the next generation of heroes to the best of my abilities. And these old bones still have a few good miles left. He smiled brilliantly and flexed his thinner arm. I guess that would make sense. Kachan combed his hair back and sighed at the revelation. You've been a hero for 40-odd years. It's time for a new symbol to rise. He nodded sagely. What are you doing, young Izuku? He asked the feral boy whose fingers were reaching towards his hair. Izuku didn't say anything and grabbed a tuft of his dangling hair and snipped it off with blades that emerged from his fingers. He held the small tuft of blonde hair in the air and then a bone clasp tied it together at the cut end to keep it from falling apart. Perfect, he said, holding his newest trophy. Kachan stared at his friend with just a little bit of horror. Yagi was staring with his eyebrows raised. What the fuck, Izuku? You can't just take a clipping of his hair like some psycho. He looked at the now uneven hair tufts on the number 1 hero's head. He can grow it back. It's my trophy, Izuku said defensively and crouched down to run. Yagi chuckled heartily and waved them down. It's quite all right, he earned it. At that moment, Recovery Girl rolled up in a golf cart specialized for first aid. You don't know when to hold back, do you? Any of you, she said with anger lacing her tone. It's not their fault, I pushed them to their limits. Yagi defended them. It's the number fucking 1 hero, why the hell would I have held back? Kachan said with crossed arms. I still don't like you, Izuku said, narrowing his eyes on her. Recovery Girl shook her head at all of them and helped Yagi onto the cart and the stretcher behind it. How are you two doing? Injuries? A few, Kachan said, looking down at his road-burned arms. I don't need your help, Izuku said with his arms crossed. Kachan stared at him with furrowed brows. What, she called me idiotic and hit me, he said defensively. Kachan rolled his eyes and got a healing kiss from her and boarded the cart. Izuku declined the ride since his weight would have slowed the vehicle too much. He instead ran beside the cart to the main building of UA. The two arrived back at the classroom in their uniforms to see some of their classmates already there and waiting. Izuku went over to Mina when he saw her looking down at her desk. Izuku quietly went to her and tapped her horn to get her attention. She covered her horn with her hand and looked up to see Izuku smiling softly at her. She pouted but smiled back anyways. You looked sad, did something happen? Izuku asked, sitting down on the ground since his desk only can hold his weight. Mina sighed and sat with him, their backs against the wall. We failed our exam. Nezu was just too good and we didn't even get a chance. She dropped her head on his shoulder. Izuku comforted her by hugging her. I'm sure it'll be fine. Just because you failed once doesn't mean you didn't learn anything. And that's the point of school, right? To learn stuff and things, he said softly. Mina gave a watery giggle and looked up with teary eyes. But her smile was evident. Right, I'll do better next time. Thank you, Izuku. After wiping her face, she wrapped her arms around his chest and squeezed as much as she could. Izuku stayed next to her as more of his classmates came in after their practical exam was done. He hummed in pleasure at feeling his mate close to him and his pack around him. Mina looked up at him curiously but didn't ask anything, knowing he had his odd quirks. When everyone had arrived from their exams, Aizawa strolled in and told them to go home. Everyone did so and Izuku walked with Mina and his friends to the train station. They chatted about their fights and how it went for them. Izuku listened to them all and excitedly told them about his fight with the number 1 hero. And then, he surrendered after digging himself out of the rubble. I think he could have kept on going if he wanted, though. But look, Izuku held up the newest trophy. They all stopped and stared at the small tuft of hair in confusion. Shinso was the first to realize what he was looking at. Izuku, you didn't. he asked, already knowing the answer. No, Jiro exclaimed in shock. Is that All Might's hair? She whispered loudly to not draw attention. Mina burst out laughing and hung off her mate's shoulders. Zuko. She laughed some more. Shoji chuckled softly and shook his head. I can't wait to see if he left it like that or clipped the other side to even it out. Izuku continued their walk to the train station to see them off. One after another, they boarded their train and left Izuku and Mina alone. She kissed his cheek goodbye and boarded her train with a wave. He smiled warmly at her and watched her go. Then he turned back to the streets and was immediately lost. He nervously looked around, but he resigned himself to taking out his phone and inputting the direction back to his den. For the rest of the walk, he grumbled about how the city was loud and all the smells mixed, which blocked his sense of smell. The weekend after the midterms arrived and Izuku was invited to Shinso's home for dinner. He was excited to go see how his friend lived and what his mother was like. But before that, he decided to stop by Asato's library to say hello. While they did talk on the phone, he did miss seeing her in person. On the train, Izuku watched his phone carefully to see which stop he was supposed to get off at. He faintly remembered seeing some buildings as they passed from leaving the woods fully when he took the entrance exams. He got off the train and began following the indicator to Asato's library. He had decided to visit her first before going to Shinso's home. Once he got close, he could remember the area fairly well and put his phone away. He saw the library down the street and excitedly jogged to the front door. He opened the doors quietly as he had done 100 times before and walked in. Asato looked up from her desk to greet whoever came in and smiled brilliantly at seeing who it was. Izuku, how wonderful to see you, she said softly and rounded the desk to hug him. Nice to see you too. Izuku hugged her back. She pulled him an arm's length away to get a good look at him. You haven't grown much, but those horns are new. Izuku beamed and tilted his head down slightly to show them off. I grew them myself. Asato laughed and examined them. Any particular reason why? Izuku nodded. I wanted to match with Mina, plus if I didn't like them I could get rid of them. He shrugged. Ah, your girlfriend. You haven't done anything inappropriate, have you? She asked teasingly. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Like what? Asato chuckled and pulled him over to sit down at his old table. Don't worry about it, she waved his concerns away. Fill me in, how have you been? She asked in a more motherly way. Izuku did so. He told her about his time at UA and how he had made all his friends. How the teacher treated him. He told her about meeting with his old friend and his family. They spent roughly an hour talking about their time since Izuku had joined UA. By the end of it, Izuku had left with a brilliant smile on his face. Instead of taking out his phone to find Shinso's home, he followed the well-trodden route to his old den. He found it easily and from there made his way to Shinso's backyard. He knocked on the front door and waited. He could hear some footsteps on the other side. Shinso opened the door and smiled tiredly at his friend. Come on in. Hi, Shinso. Izuku beamed happily. He walked in after wiping his paws on the entrance rug. He followed Shinso to the living room and sat down on the ground to save the furniture from destruction. His friend frowned for a moment at seeing why he did such a thing and remember why. He followed suit and sat on the ground with him. They talked for a bit about the upcoming camping trip and what they would need for supplies. Shinso asked how his relationship with Mina was going and Izuku happily told him about their time hanging out after school. So, this is the feral boy that lived in my backyard for a few years. A woman's voice came from behind them. Izuku turned and smiled brilliantly at seeing the mother of his friend. Yep, that's me, I'm Izuku, he greeted her while standing up. The woman had straight light purple hair with a lean figure. She stood about the same height as her son. She smiled warmly at the boys and introduced herself. You can call me Kurata, it's very nice to finally meet you. She pulled Izuku into a tight hug, much to her son's embarrassment. Izuku was surprised by the sudden embrace but smiled and returned the hug. You give nice hugs, he said as they pulled away. Kurata laughed with delight. It's mostly my quirk, it allows me to emit a warm and welcoming aura. It's very helpful in my profession. What's your profession? Izuku asked with a tilt of his head. Child psychiatrist, I've been working with children for a long time," she said, looking at her son and combing his hair back. "That's a job that helps kids with mental stuff, right?" Izuku asked. "Yep," they both said at the same time. Kurata motioned them to the kitchen. "Let's eat before the food gets cold. Toshi, set the table." "Toshi," Izuku said, grinning at his friend's blushing face. Toshi grumbled with a reddened face and set the table from the three of them. Izuku walked over and helped him with some tendrils to speed up the process. Toshi didn't even bat an eye, but Kurata stared for longer than would have been polite. Once the food was set in each place, they began to dig in while talking between bites of food. Izuku answered any questions Kurata had without any reservations. He got a few laughs when she began to tell stories about Toshi's younger years. When they finished dinner, Izuku stuck around for a bit longer to chat as the sun began to lower. Kurata offered Izuku to stay for the night, but he was more comfortable sleeping in his den. "I'll walk you to the station to make sure you don't get lost," Toshi said. Kurata gave Izuku a brief hug and smiled down at him. "Come back any time if you ever need anything or just to say hello." Izuku returned the smile and nodded. "Bye, Kurata." With that, the two left the home. The weekend passed and came Monday, with the class anxiously waiting for their homeroom teacher to announce their grades on the midterms. It was quiet in the room as Aizawa walked in. He paused the intense gazes of his students but walked to his podium and looked over them all. "Everyone passed the written exam and 4 of you failed the practical. You know who failed, but everyone gets to come to the camp anyways," he said before anyone's tears fell. The class cheered, with the 4 that failed the most ecstatic. The glare Aizawa gave them shut them up and everyone quieted down in a flash. "You 4 will have remedial course while the rest have fun," he finished with a malicious smirk. "What? No, no, no," Mina cried, with Kaminari looking dead-eyed out the window. "You can do whatever you want for the rest of homeroom." Aizawa ignored the pleas from the 2 who had to face Nezu. His eyes landed on the feral boy by the window. "Except for you, Izuku. Midnight and I would like a word." The class went quiet and Izuku looked around nervously at the sudden attention and the quiet. Aizawa let out a long suffering sigh. "You're not in trouble, now let's go." Izuku got up and quickly followed Aizawa out the door. He caught up to him and walked beside him. "What's going on?" "It's about the camp, nothing bad. Just something you should know is all." He shrugged. Izuku nodded and the two made their way to the teacher's lounge, where Nem stood up immediately after the door opened. She gave Izuku a warm smile and bade him follow into a private room with Aizawa next to him. He returned the smile as Nem waited for him at the open door to ruffle his hair. They all sat down and Izuku looked at the two in confusion. "Now, I want to start this off by saying we do this every year. It's a tradition and we mean no ill will by doing it, but with you. You might see it differently." Nem began. "During the training camp, we load the class onto a bus and drive out into the location. The tradition is to stop in a certain location to stretch your legs, but it's more of a trap." Izuku listened intently but felt his stomach twist slightly. He didn't interrupt as she continued. "From there, we have the students finish the rest of the trek on foot through the woods." She immediately grasped Izuku's hands when she saw the hurt in his eyes. "We will not leave you, okay? I will not leave you as that woman did. It's part of the training camp and a bit of fun, that's why we're telling you ahead of time so you don't get the wrong idea. You are not being abandoned, I promise." Izuku felt his throat close up at the memory of Inko doing such a thing and then his imagination making up Nem doing the same thing. "You promise?" "I promise I will not ever leave you like that. You will always be welcomed into my arms." Nem rounded the coffee table and pulled him into a tight embrace. Izuku hugged her back and tried to calm himself. Aizawa looked down in a way to give the two a sense of privacy. He was the one who brought up the issue that might crop up if they didn't inform Izuku about the tradition. And how that would affect the boy who was in a very similar situation before. The only time Izuku had voiced something he didn't like was when they first drove him to his old den for his things, and Aizawa would be remiss to forget such a detail. Once Izuku had calmed down, Aizawa told him about the area they would be training in. The site is somewhat removed from the city. It's a large forest compared to the area of your old den. Izuku looked over to the usually stoic man with red-rimmed eyes. "Can I hunt in it?" Nem chuckled and Aizawa let out an exasperated sigh. Most likely, but I'll ask just in case. Izuku nodded and sniffed once before using his quirk to free up his nose from snot. He turned to Aizawa when he spoke again. Nimari is right, we won't ever leave you like that. None of us, maybe all might, but I think it would have been more out of negligence than malice. He smirked at the end. Izuku chuckled at the joke and smiled with them. The three of them stayed for a bit longer to chat until Aizawa deemed that they wasted enough time and Izuku should head back to class. With another tight hug from Nem, Izuku left to join the rest of his class. When he opened the door, his classmates all looked straight at him with questions in their eyes. Izuku beamed at all of them and sat down for some toss to continue the lesson. The day progressed without any issues and the lunch period started. What did you do? Toshi immediately asked when class ended. The rest of the class similarly were curious. Iida spoke before anyone could. It is a private affair between him and the staff, he said, chopping his hand. Izuku shook his head with a smile. It's nothing, just Nem and Aizawa telling me something I should know. Is it bad? Mina asked with a furrowed brow. Not really, just a warning, I guess. He shrugged, and with that, they began to stream out of the class to head to lunch. The small group of friends sat together for lunch and chatted about the upcoming training camp and what they think they will get to do. Izuku listened intently as they told him about the usual things people did while camping, and he grew more excited as they talked about it. Granted, for him it was like any other day, but it would be spent with his friends and mate in the woods. The last class of the day ended and everyone began to pack to leave. But Mina and Hagakure thought up the idea of going group shopping for the supplies they would need for the camp. Yaoruzo's eyes shone at the idea and took charge by organizing the day and time. Most everyone joined except for Todoroki, who visited his mother on the weekends, and Kachan, who began to decline the invitation but was stopped by Izuku's next action. Aunt Suki, the class wants to do a shopping trip for the things we need for the camp, and Kachan is saying he will be busy this weekend, is he? Everyone stared at Izuku with his phone to his ear. Kachan was the one who acted first by lunging at his old friend. Izuku jumped onto a desk to get away and ran away from Kachan, who was cursing at him. Speaker. This button. Izuku tapped the screen on his phone after his aunt asked him to. Katsuki, you need to be more social. Don't you lie and say you're busy. You're going with your friends on the shopping trip and that's final. She said for everyone to hear. Kachan gritted his teeth and said through clenched teeth. Fine, I will, he said the last part while glaring at Izuku, who was smiling a wide smile. That's wonderful to hear. All right, I'll talk to you later, Zuku. Take care, Mitsuki said before hanging up. Mina was the first to burst out laughing, with the rest of the class hiding the chortle laugher behind their hands. Kachan's face grew slightly pink and then red as he threw himself at Izuku, who slipped on the desk while trying to get away. The papers that caused his paw to slip flew into the air and fluttered down. He came crashing down and Kachan landed on top of him. Toshi had his phone out and recorded the aggressive wrestling between the two. Mina's laughter doubled by seeing her mate slip in the most comical way she could have ever seen. Iida was trying to admonish the two on the ground for different reasons, while the rest of the class began to laugh more and more at the ridiculous scene. Izuku managed to slip out of Kachan's grip and climbed the wall to get away. He clung to the corner of the ceiling and sat there like a giant spider in its web. You're coming. Aunt Suki said so. Get down here so I can kick your ass properly. Kachan roared over the laughter of his classmates. Don't say bad words, Izuku. It's most improper to damage the wall of the school. Iida continued to lecture and point at the holes Izuku made with his claws climbing. So then, everyone but Todoroki will be joining us at the mall. Yaoruzo said, making a note. Kachan turned a glare at the heiress and Izuku took that chance to skitter on the ceiling to the exit. Oi, but it was too late as Izuku swung down and out the classroom door and out of view. Tsuyu watched with her head tilted. I didn't know he could stick to walls. That animal can't look at the holes he left behind, Toshi said, pointing at the wall and ceiling where there were many holes from where Izuku's claws dug into the surfaces. Once it was pointed out, the class noticed and then looked at each other. Kaminari grabbed his bag quickly and bolted out the door. Last one out has to tell Aizawa. Everyone reacted quickly and scrambled out the door. many tripping over themselves not to be last. Suyu used her tongue to grab her bag from across the room while Uraraka pushed herself off the walls and ceiling in zero gravity. Iida tried to stop them all from acting the way they did but failed. He and Yaoyorozu were the last in the room as everyone escaped. Unbelievable. To think they are all striving to be heroes, Iida said and then turned to Yaoyorozu. She cleared her throat and then stepped over the threshold of the classroom. Iida gave her the most unimpressed look he could give her. I'm sure Aizawa will understand, she said as she looked away from his judging gaze. I will see you this weekend at the mall. She left with a barely contained smile. Iida pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed. He resigned himself to telling Aizawa about the damages. As much as he likes his class president, Izuku could get a bit too feral at times. He still smiled as he remembered getting pulled aside by Izuku and talking him down from doing something incredibly dangerous and reckless. He only wished that he wasn't the last one in the classroom. To be continued. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and now we will see you in the next video.